At my retirement party, my son walked up to the microphone and demanded my keys. Hand them over. Dad, you are done here. He said it in front of every worker I ever protected. Then the old foreman walked in with the payroll records, and my son's arrogant smile vanished completely. My name is Jameson, a 69-year-old man who spent 4 decades building a logistics empire from a single rusted truck. I thought I was handing my legacy to a capable son. I was handing it to a thief. Before I reveal what happened next, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who mistook your silence for weakness. The warehouse smelled of diesel fuel and roasted barbecue, a staple for any celebration we threw at the yard. Over 200 of my drivers, loaders, and mechanics stood around the makeshift stage constructed from wooden pallets. I held the microphone looking out at the men and women who helped me build this freight company from nothing. I was halfway through thanking them for their loyalty when a hand firmly grabbed my shoulder. Darren stepped in front of me. My 38-year-old son snatched the microphone from my grip. The feedback whined sharply through the speakers. The crowd fell dead silent. Darren adjusted his tailored suit jacket, a stark contrast to the steel toe boots and high-visibility vests surrounding him. Thank you for the memories, Dad, but your era is officially over. Darren spoke with a cold corporate cadence. The modern logistics world requires ruthless efficiency, not nostalgic hand-holding. I stared at him. He did not look like the boy I raised. He looked at me with absolute disdain. He turned his back to the crowd and lowered his voice just enough for me to hear. Hand them over, Dad. I need the master keys to the executive office in the main vault. Right now, you are done here. I glanced past his shoulder. In the front row, his wife Melanie stood sipping a glass of expensive champagne. She wore a pristine white designer dress in a dirty warehouse, smirking at me as if she had just won a prize fight. She raised her glass in a mocking toast. Darren snapped his fingers impatiently. The keys, old man. Give them to me, or I will have security escort you off the premises. The absolute disrespect hung heavily in the humid air of the warehouse. He was attempting to strip me of my dignity in front of the very people I had protected and provided for over the last 40 years. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to yell, to fight back, to prove his claim that I was an emotional, outdated relic. I did not give him that satisfaction. I remained perfectly still, processing the sheer audacity of his demand. I realized in that exact moment that the boy standing in front of me was a stranger fueled entirely by unearned entitlement. He wanted the crown without shedding a single drop of blood to earn it. The tension in the room escalated as the workers stared at us, waiting to see how I would respond to this blatant public humiliation. My fingers brushed against the heavy brass key ring attached to my belt loop. Every key on that ring represented a milestone in my life. I remembered standing in a muddy lot 40 years ago, staring at a single rusted truck with bald tires. My late wife Evelyn had handed me our life savings in a thin paper envelope to buy it. We ate canned soup for 2 years so I could afford gas and insurance. I built this empire, waking up at 3 in the morning, hauling freight across state lines and sleeping in the cab of my truck. I broke my back loading crates so Darren would never have to sweep a warehouse floor or beg another man for a paycheck. Evelyn died 5 years ago, holding my hand and asking me to make sure Darren grew into a man of honor. I gave him operational control of the company 3 years ago so I could care for her during her final months. I trusted my own blood. I never legally transferred the primary shares. Darren assumed the seat behind the desk meant he owned the entire building. He mistook my trust for complete surrender. He believed my grief over Evelyn was a permanent weakness he could easily exploit to take complete control of the empire I built with my bare hands. I slowly unclipped the heavy keyring from my belt. I placed it directly into his outstretched palm without a single word of protest. The metallic clink echoed loudly through the silent warehouse. A low murmur of shock rippled through the crowd of workers. They looked at me with confusion and rising anger. They knew Darren did not respect them. I had always been the shield standing between the workers and Darren's corporate greed. Now they saw their shield stepping down. Darren smiled, pocketing the keys. He tapped the microphone. As the new permanent chief executive officer, I have an immediate announcement regarding the future of this company. We are moving into a new phase of maximum profitability. Effective immediately, we are instituting a 20% staff reduction across all departments to trim the fat. The murmur exploded into a roar of outrage. Men who had worked for me for 20 years shouted in disbelief. Melanie stepped up to the edge of the stage, glaring at the workers with open disgust. She shouted at them to be quiet and accept the reality of corporate restructuring. She called them replaceable commodities. I did not intervene. I turned away from the microphone and walked toward the wooden steps leading down from the stage. Darren laughed into the microphone, telling the crowd that complaints would not save their jobs. He commanded the security guards to stand by the exits. The atmosphere turned completely toxic. I reached the bottom of the stairs, feeling the cold concrete floor beneath my shoes. I did not look back at my son. I let him bask in his stolen authority. Let him believe he had conquered the kingdom. He thought he held all the power because he held a set of brass keys. He had no idea that true power is never handed over in a warehouse. True power is leverage, and I was about to let him discover exactly how heavy the crown truly was. The shouting behind me grew louder, completely drowning out the celebration music that had been playing just minutes before. The workers surged forward, pressing against the security guards. Darren stood on the stage completely oblivious to the real danger of inciting a mob of men who operated heavy machinery for a living. He simply adjusted his tie, arrogant and utterly clueless about the storm he had just summoned. Before I could reach the main exit, the heavy steel double doors at the back of the warehouse violently banged open. Garrett pushed his way into the building. He was 65 years old, my very first employee, and a man who had driven over 1,000,000 miles for this company. He was breathing heavily, rain dripping from his gray hair. He completely ignored Darren, barking orders from the stage. Garrett walked straight through the angry crowd, his boots stomping loudly against the concrete. He marched directly toward me. He shoved a thick red ledger hard against my chest. His eyes were wide with a mixture of panic and fury. "Jameson, look at these numbers." Garrett shouted the words so loudly that they echoed off the high metal ceiling, cutting through the noise of the crowd. "Our health insurance premiums have not been paid in 6 months. The provider just canceled every single policy retroactively." The entire warehouse went dead silent again. On the stage, Darren dropped the microphone. It hit the wooden boards with a loud thud. The arrogant smile completely vanished from his face, replaced by a sudden, sickening pale hue. The workers turned their heads, their furious eyes locking onto the man who had just stolen their livelihoods and their safety nets. I took the heavy red ledger from Garrett. The leather cover felt damp from the freezing rain he had dragged in from the yard. I flipped it open right there on the stage. The warehouse remained dead silent. Every eye in the building was locked on my hands. I bypassed the summary pages and went straight to the raw operational expenditures. My eyes scanned the columns with the practiced speed of a man who had built a regional logistics empire from a single dime. The numbers painted a grotesque and undeniable picture. Massive capital outflows were meticulously recorded under the guise of equipment upgrades and facility maintenance. I saw entries for new hydraulic lifts, tire shipments, and engine overhauls. Yet I knew for a fact that not a single new forklift diagnostic machine or spare tire had entered this yard in 14 months. Over $400,000 were missing in a single quarter alone. The withdrawal dates matched the exact weeks the workers' health insurance premium checks were supposed to clear the company accounts. The money meant to protect the families of my drivers had been systematically siphoned into phantom vendor accounts. I traced the routing numbers printed in the margins. The destinations were heavily obscured, but the malicious intent was glaringly obvious. My own son was deliberately bleeding the company dry. Darren lunged forward. He reached out to snatch the ledger from my grip. He forced a tight, artificial laugh that echoed awkwardly off the high metal rafters. He turned to the crowd and told them it was nothing but a simple administrative error. He claimed the accounting department had miscoded the insurance payments during a recent software migration. He promised the entire situation would be completely resolved by Monday morning. He stretched his hand toward the book again, his fingers twitching with desperate anxiety. I did not pull the ledger away. I simply stepped back. I looked at him. I did not scream. I did not curse. I just stared into his eyes with absolute suffocating silence. My silence had always been my heaviest weapon on the negotiation table. Darren's hand dropped to his side. The artificial smile melted off his face, replaced by a genuine creeping panic. He recognized that look. He knew I saw right through the cheap accounting trick. He knew I had just calculated the exact magnitude of his theft in my head. 3 years ago, the doctors gave my wife Evelyn 6 months to live. I made a choice that any devoted husband would make. I walked away from the daily operations of the company I built to sit by her hospital bed. I handed Darren the temporary operational reins. He was my only son. I trusted my own blood to keep the massive engines running while I buried my heart. I signed the specific legal documents allowing him to authorize payroll, manage vendor contracts, and oversee the day-to-day logistics fleet. I wanted him to feel the heavy weight of leadership. I wanted him to step up and honor the massive legacy his mother and I had sacrificed everything to create. We had spent decades building a reputation of absolute integrity in the freight business. I assumed Darren understood the profound value of that reputation. I was not a fool. A man who survives 40 years in the cutthroat freight industry does not surrender his armor entirely. I never officially transferred the primary voting shares to him. I never relinquished my status as the sole majority owner of the corporation. Darren held the steering wheel, but I still owned the engine, the chassis, and the road it drove on. He assumed my deep grief had blinded me to the legal realities of our corporate structure. He thought my prolonged absence from the boardroom meant my mind had deteriorated. He mistook a grieving husband for a weak, oblivious old man. Melanie stepped sharply in front of Darren, her designer high heels clicking aggressively against the wooden stage. She positioned herself directly between me and the crowd, shielding her husband's cowardice. She raised her chin and used her loud, shrill voice to completely dismiss Garrett. She pointed a perfectly manicured finger directly at my oldest foreman. She told him he was entirely out of line and severely violating the strict company chain of command. She declared that bringing baseless payroll grievances to a retirement party was highly unprofessional and deeply disrespectful to the new executive management. She did not stop there. She threatened to fire Garrett on the spot for gross insubordination. She told the crowd that anyone who sided with a disgruntled aging mechanic would join him in the unemployment line before the day ended. She reminded them that their contracts were at will, and she had the legal team on speed dial to enforce it. She was trying to establish absolute dominance by publicly crushing the most respected man on the warehouse floor. Garrett did not flinch. He looked at me, his jaw set hard, waiting for the order to tear the place apart. The workers shifted on their feet, their fists clenched tightly, their faces hardened with betrayal. A single word from me would have incited a violent riot. They would have dragged Darren and Melanie out of that warehouse by their expensive collars. They were entirely ready to dismantle the wooden stage piece by piece. But a riot would only give Darren the legal leverage he desperately needed. He would immediately call the police, press assault charges against my men, and play the innocent victim in front of the corporate board of directors. I refuse to give my enemies the exact reaction they desire. Uncontrolled anger is a massive liability when you need surgical precision. I closed the red ledger with a loud, definitive snap. I handed it back to Garrett. I told him to keep the book entirely safe and instruct the men to go home peacefully. I turned my back on my son and his wife. I walked down the center aisle of the warehouse, feeling the heavy, expectant gaze of 200 betrayed workers on my back. I did not offer them empty reassurances. I pushed open the heavy steel doors and stepped out into the freezing, pouring rain. The cold water hit my face, washing away the last lingering illusions I held about my son. The battle lines were officially drawn. I got into my truck, the heavy diesel engine roaring to life. I did not drive to my house. I drove straight to the downtown financial district. I needed to cut off the oxygen to Darren's fire immediately. I had to freeze the operational capital before he could bleed the company entirely dry. I walked through the massive glass doors of my private bank, my boots leaving wet tracks on the polished marble floor. I went directly to the executive offices and demanded an immediate freeze on all corporate operational accounts. I instructed the bank manager to instantly revoke Darren's signatory access and permanently halt all outbound wire transfers. The manager, a man I had done highly profitable business with for 15 years, looked at me with deep, visible discomfort. He nervously adjusted his glasses, cleared his throat, and outright refused my request. He told me he was incredibly sorry, but his hands were completely tied. He stated he no longer had the legal authority to execute my directives on those accounts. I demanded a full explanation, my voice dropping to a dangerously quiet register. The manager opened his desk drawer. His hands were shaking noticeably. He slid a thick, notarized document across the polished mahogany wood. I picked it up. It was a medical power of attorney. It bore the official raised seal of the state court and the unmistakable signature of a presiding judge. The document explicitly stated that I had been thoroughly evaluated by a licensed neurologist and diagnosed with severe rapid-onset dementia. According to the state judicial system, I was entirely incapable of managing my own financial affairs. I had been officially and legally declared mentally incompetent. I stared at the heavy cream paper resting on the polished mahogany desk. The words typed across the top were bold and definitive. medical power of attorney, and declaration of incompetence. My eyes scanned the dense legal jargon, tracing the lines that systematically stripped away my autonomy. The document claimed I suffered from advanced rapid-onset dementia. It described me as highly disoriented, prone to aggressive outbursts, and completely incapable of managing basic financial or personal affairs. The bank manager sat silently across from me, his hands folded tightly in his lap, refusing to meet my gaze. He treated me as if the diagnosis were already an absolute truth. I did not raise my voice or hurl accusations at him. I simply picked up the paper and scrutinized the bottom of the second page. There, stamped next to a golden notary seal, was the signature of the authorizing physician, Dr. Harrison Sterling. He was a prominent private neurologist with a highly exclusive practice in the wealthiest zip code of the city. He was also Melanie's maternal uncle. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with sickening clarity. Darren did not possess the cunning or the connections to orchestrate a legally binding medical coup in less than 48 hours. Melanie did. She had weaponized her elite social network to bypass standard medical protocols. She bypassed the mandatory independent evaluations, the psychiatric hold observations, and the family court hearings. She used her family's deep pockets and high society influence to buy a fraudulent diagnosis. They were not just stealing my logistics company. They were actively erasing my legal existence. By rendering me a ward of the state, they effectively placed Darren in total control of every single asset I had ever built over the last 40 years. I handed the document back to the manager. He reached for it tentatively, as if expecting me to violently snap. I told him to log the exact time of my visit and strictly note that I appeared entirely lucid and firmly in control of my faculties. I turned and walked out of the executive office. The marble floors of the lobby echoed with each measured step I took. I stepped back out into the freezing rain. The cold air filled my lungs, pushing out the initial shock. I was not a victim. I was a man who had navigated cutthroat freight wars and union disputes. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket. I needed a shark, and I knew exactly who to call. Dr. Harrison Sterling's name unlocked a sudden flood of bitter memories. I sat in the driver's seat of my truck, watching the heavy rain hammer relentlessly against the windshield. 5 years ago, my wife Evelyn had pulled me aside after Darren brought Melanie home for the very first time. Evelyn was a perceptive woman who could read a person's soul within 5 minutes of meeting them. She told me to watch my back. She warned me that Melanie's family looked at our hard-earned success entirely differently. They did not see the 40 years of calluses, the motor grease, and the sleepless nights that built our massive freight empire from the ground up. They saw new money. They saw a blue-collar African-American family that had somehow stumbled into a fortune they felt inherently entitled to manage and control. Melanie's family came from generations of inherited wealth. They viewed people like me not as equals, but as a heavily stocked bank vault waiting to be raided. I had ignored Evelyn's sharp warning back then. I wanted my son to be happy. I wanted him to seamlessly fit into the high society world he so desperately wanted to belong to. That blind paternal hope had blinded me to the vicious predators sitting at my own dinner table. The Sterling family had finally made their calculated move, using a medical license as a deadly weapon. I dialed Oliver's private number. He answered on the second ring. I did not waste time with casual pleasantries. I gave him an address for a 24-hour diner on the industrial side of town and told him it was a matter of total corporate survival. Oliver was my lead corporate attorney. More importantly, he owed his entire career to me. When his father died in a tragic loading dock accident 30 years ago, I paid for Oliver's undergraduate and law school tuition entirely out of my own pocket. I never asked for a single dime back. I only asked for his absolute professional loyalty. He arrived at the diner 20 minutes later, shaking off a soaking wet trench coat. We sat in a dimly lit booth in the back corner, far away from the few late-night truck drivers hunched over their black coffees. I handed him a digital photo of the medical proxy I had snapped at the bank. Oliver adjusted his glasses. His eyes darted across the digital document. His jaw tightened immediately. He pulled out his own highly encrypted tablet and accessed the county court's digital filing system. His fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard. After 3 minutes of absolute dead silence, he looked up at me. His face was rigid with contained anger. He confirmed the worst possible scenario. The document was not just a temporary banking hold. Darren and Melanie had quietly filed an expedited emergency petition with the probate court. They claimed my calm behavior at the retirement party was actually a severe episode of violent, unpredictable dementia. They were aggressively pushing for a state-mandated psychiatric hold. The presiding judge had already rubber-stamped the preliminary review without demanding a secondary opinion. Oliver leaned across the sticky diner table. His voice dropped to a harsh whisper. He told me the transport van was strictly scheduled to arrive at my house by Monday morning. If they physically got me into that state-run psychiatric facility, the temporary conservatorship would instantly become completely permanent. I would be locked behind heavy steel doors, heavily medicated, and completely stripped of my basic constitutional rights. I would have no mobile phone, no legal voice, and absolutely no way to contact the outside world. Darren would seamlessly become the absolute legal master of my life and my entire financial legacy. I did not panic. Panic breeds fatal mistakes. I ordered Oliver to immediately bypass the standard legal injunctions and dig directly into the shadow ledgers of the company. I needed to know exactly what Darren was rushing to accomplish before the psychiatric van arrived on Monday morning. Oliver tapped into the highly secure back end of the corporate financial routing system. The screen of his tablet illuminated his face with a pale blue glow. He stopped breathing for a fraction of a second. He slowly turned the screen toward me. There was a massive pending transaction queued in the central clearinghouse. Darren was aggressively attempting to move $3 million from the company's emergency operational reserve. The destination was a heavily obscured, untraceable offshore shell account officially registered in the Cayman Islands. The money was meant to completely drain the company's vital lifeblood, leaving the hard-working truck drivers with nothing but a bankrupt shell just before the holidays. Oliver pointed a shaking finger to the digital timestamp blinking steadily at the top corner of the screen. The international wire transfer was set on an automated delay to strictly avoid immediate federal fraud detection protocols. It would completely clear the Federal Reserve and become legally unrecoverable in exactly 48 hours. The countdown clock had officially started ticking. Friday morning broke with the deafening roar of 100 diesel engines idling in protest. I pulled my heavy truck onto the main access road leading to the primary freight yard and found the massive iron gates completely padlocked shut. A thick, impenetrable wall of men and women stood shoulder to shoulder across the entrance holding hand-painted signs demanding their stolen health benefits and unpaid wages. Behind them, an endless line of 18-wheelers stretched all the way back to the interstate highway, their chrome grills gleaming under the heavy overcast sky. Horns blared in a rhythmic, aggressive cadence that rattled the windows of my cab and shook the wet asphalt beneath my tires. At the center of the chaos stood Garrett, his arms crossed over his chest like a stone statue, refusing to yield a single inch of ground to the corporate management. Directly opposite the picket line, 3 local police cruisers sat with their light bars painting the rain-slicked road in aggressive strokes of red and blue. Darren was pacing furiously in front of the officers. His expensive tailored suit was getting completely ruined by the morning mist, but he was far too enraged to care about his appearance. He pointed a shaking finger at Garrett and screamed at the police captain to arrest the union leaders immediately. He demanded they break out the heavy bolt cutters, destroy the chains, and forcibly clear the property of trespassers. He shouted that these men were violating a federal commerce route and actively sabotaging corporate logistics operations. The police captain simply stood with his hands resting securely on his utility belt, completely unbothered by Darren's frantic, high-pitched commands. The officers knew exactly who owned this yard, and they knew a legal, fully authorized strike when they saw one. Darren threw his hands in the air, his face flushed with panicked desperation, realizing his shiny corporate titles meant absolutely nothing to the men holding the line. He was a false king screaming at a rising tide that absolutely refused to recede. The operational heartbeat of the entire logistics company had flatlined under his incompetent management in less than 24 hours. He grabbed his smartphone and began making frantic calls to his lawyers, completely unaware that his authority had already been systematically dismantled from the inside out. I watched him pace like a cornered animal, entirely stripped of his unearned confidence. He looked utterly powerless against the very workforce he had tried to discard. I sat quietly in my cab, studying the weathered faces of the men standing shoulder to shoulder against the heavy rain. I did not just see a workforce demanding a paycheck. I saw 40 years of shared survival and mutual sacrifice. I recognized Malcolm Hayes in the front row holding a protest sign high above his head. I paid his wife's hospital bills in full when his corporate insurance denied her cancer treatments 12 years ago. Standing right next to him was Simon Carter, a man who had driven for me since the very first day I opened the dirt yard. I secretly funded his daughter's engineering degree because I knew Simon sent every extra dollar he earned back to his sick mother in Georgia. Darren looked at these hardworking men and saw only replaceable liabilities on a financial balance sheet. He viewed their health insurance as an unnecessary expense hindering his quarterly profit margins. I built this massive empire on the absolute certainty that if you fiercely protect the men turning the wheels, they will drive through literal fire to protect your business. Loyalty is never bought with a weekly direct deposit. It is forged in the trenches of real life through decades of mutual respect. Darren never understood the profound difference between managing an asset and leading a family. A sleek silver sports car aggressively bypassed the line of idling transport trucks and swerved dangerously onto the gravel shoulder. Melanie threw the vehicle into park and stormed out her designer high heels, sinking immediately into the thick mud. She marched directly toward the barricade with absolute entitlement radiating from every single step. She did not ask the police for assistance or assess the volatile situation. She marched right up to the strike line and screamed at the top of her lungs. She called the men ungrateful, replaceable trash who should be begging for their minimum wage jobs. She threatened to replace every single driver with automated routing systems and non-union contractors by the end of the week. Her shrill voice sliced harshly through the heavy rumble of the diesel engines. She pointed directly at Garrett and demanded he unlock the gates before she personally ruined his retirement fund. I pushed open the door of my truck and stepped out onto the wet asphalt. I closed the door with a solid, echoing thud. The moment my heavy boots hit the ground, a profound shift rippled across the entire yard. The angry shouting from the workers died instantly. The blaring truck horns fell completely silent one by one. The police officers immediately stepped back, respectfully lowering their hands from their belts. Melanie froze mid-sentence, turning her head to stare at me with absolute wide-eyed disbelief. Darren saw me walking toward the main gate, and his corporate panic rapidly morphed into vicious desperation. He reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out the forged medical proxy. He ran toward the police captain, violently waving the fraudulent document in the air. He ordered the armed officers to detain me instantly. He shouted that I was legally declared mentally incompetent and a severe danger to myself and the public. He claimed I was suffering from advanced dementia and needed to be forcibly removed from the premises and placed in a psychiatric ward for my own safety. He was attempting to weaponize his fraudulent court order right there on the pavement to strip me of my freedom in front of my own men. The police captain looked at the stamped legal paper, then looked at me, clearly hesitant to lay a hand on a man who commanded this much silent respect. I did not raise my voice. I did not attempt to argue with my son or desperately defend my sanity. I simply locked eyes with Garrett across the heavy iron barricade. I gave him a single subtle nod and told him to unlock the gates for two specific unmarked black trucks idling quietly at the very back of the line. Darren's chest heaved with sudden relief. He let out a loud, triumphant laugh, falsely assuming I had just publicly surrendered to his legal authority and broken the union strike myself. Melanie smirked arrogantly, crossing her arms as the heavy iron gates slowly swung open. Darren firmly believed his brutal strategy had completely broken my spirit. He eagerly watched the two black vehicles roll past the picket line and drive directly toward the main executive building. His arrogant smile vanished entirely when the doors of the vehicles suddenly opened. Men and women wearing dark tactical windbreakers stepped out into the rain. Emblazoned across their backs in bright yellow letters were the initials of the Federal Financial Auditing Bureau. They marched straight into Darren's office, carrying empty boxes to seize every hard drive and ledger in the building. The heavy oak front door of my home violently swung open, crashing hard against the interior drywall. The sound echoed through the quiet house like a gunshot. I remained seated in my leather armchair in the living room, watching the shadows spill across the hardwood floor. Darren marched through the entryway. He did not bother to knock or use his key. He simply kicked his way into my private sanctuary. Melanie followed closely behind him, clutching her designer coat against the chill of the pouring rain outside. Flanking them were two massive private security guards dressed in matching black tactical gear. The guards stepped inside and immediately blocked the doorway, crossing their thick arms over their chests. They were hired muscle completely outside of my corporate payroll, brought here specifically to physically intimidate me in my own living room. Darren walked directly into the dining room and threw a massive stack of legal documents onto the center of the mahogany dining table. The thick pile of asset transfer papers landed with a heavy, definitive thud. Darren did not waste time with fake pleasantries or empty apologies for his aggressive intrusion. He pointed a shaking finger at the documents and demanded I sign over my primary voting shares immediately. He stated that the strike at the freight yard was a minor inconvenience, but my legal ownership of the company was a permanent obstacle he was ready to eliminate tonight. Melanie stepped out from behind his shoulder, her face twisted into a vicious, triumphant sneer. She informed me that they were not leaving this house without my legally binding signature on every single page of that asset transfer agreement. Darren pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. He told me he had a psychiatric transport van parked exactly 2 blocks down the street, idling in the rain. He stated that the medical proxy he forged gave him the absolute legal authority to commit me to a state-run mental health facility against my will. He threatened to call the orderlies to drag me out of my own home in a straitjacket if I refused to surrender the company. He looked down at me with absolute contempt, giving me exactly 60 seconds to choose between signing away my life's work or spending the rest of my days heavily medicated in a locked psychiatric ward. The 2 security guards shifted their weight, making their physical presence known, waiting for my defiance so they could forcefully restrain me. I stood up slowly from my leather armchair and walked toward the dining room. I did not look at the armed guards or the forged papers. I looked down at the edge of the solid oak dining table. Right near the corner, deeply embedded in the polished wood, was a jagged dent. I had looked at that specific dent every single day for the last 20 years. Darren caused that damage when he was 18 years old. I had canceled his first premium credit card after discovering he had racked up $30,000 in reckless luxury purchases in a single month. When I confronted him, he threw a violent, screaming tantrum, slamming a heavy brass candlestick into the dining table before storming out of the house. Evelyn had cried that night, terrified of the entitled monster our son was becoming. I made a fatal mistake back then. I quietly paid off his massive debt to protect his financial future and preserve our family reputation. I absorbed the consequences of his actions so he would not have to face them. I looked at that dent and realized my blind paternal forgiveness had taught him that he could destroy anything in his path without facing a single repercussion. I paid his debts 20 years ago to save him. I would absolutely not pay his debts tonight. I stopped at the edge of the dining table and looked up at Darren and Melanie. I knew that if I fought back right now, they would instantly call the transport van. They desperately needed me to be aggressive to justify their fraudulent medical claims to the authorities. I decided to give them exactly the performance they demanded. I deliberately let my shoulders slump forward instantly, shrinking my posture to mimic a defeated, broken old man. I made my breathing shallow and rapid, forcing a look of utter confusion and profound fear into my eyes. I looked at the 2 massive security guards and then back to the stack of legal papers, letting my hands begin to tremble violently. Darren smirked completely, buying into the sudden physical deterioration. He shoved a heavy silver pen toward my chest, demanding I stop wasting his time and sign the primary shares over to his holding company. I reached out with a violently shaking hand, intentionally fumbling the pen before gripping it awkwardly. I leaned over the table, keeping my head bowed in total submission, and began to sign the asset transfer documents. I dragged the pen across the signature lines, making sure my handwriting looked frail and erratic. I signed away the corporate bank accounts. I signed away the physical deeds to the freight yards. I signed away the primary voting shares of the logistics empire I had built with my bare hands. As my pen lifted off the final page, Melanie lunged forward and aggressively snatched the stack of papers from the table. She clutched the documents to her chest and threw her head back, laughing loudly. She mocked my trembling hands, calling my pathetic display the fitting end to a stubborn dinosaur. Darren smiled, adjusting his suit jacket, and told the guards to stand down because the crazy old man finally understood his place in the New World Order. They turned their backs on me and marched out of my home entirely victorious in their own minds. The heavy oak doors slammed shut behind them, leaving the house dead silent once again. I stood alone in the dining room, listening to the heavy engines of their vehicles accelerating down the wet street. The moment the sound faded into the rain, my entire demeanor transformed. My shoulders instantly straightened. My breathing slowed to a calm, steady rhythm. I looked down at my hands. They were perfectly still, completely devoid of any tremor. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my mobile phone. I dialed Oliver's encrypted private line. He answered immediately, waiting for the confirmation. I told my lawyer that Darren and Melanie had taken the bait completely. I confirmed they possessed the signed asset transfer agreements and were likely rushing to the bank to execute the corporate takeover. Oliver let out a low, satisfied breath on the other end of the line. We had spent the entire afternoon legally restructuring the corporate entities. The documents Darren just forced me to sign did not transfer the real wealth of my logistics empire. They were meticulously crafted dummy contracts. By signing those specific pages, I had legally granted Darren full authorized access to a heavily monitored honeypot account entirely controlled by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Every single digital move he made with those documents over the next 48 hours would be instantly recorded as undeniable proof of federal wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The trap was perfectly set. Oliver kept his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his heavily encrypted laptop. We sat in the darkest corner of the all-night diner, entirely isolated from the rest of the world. The only sound was the harsh drumming of the rain against the window pane and the rapid, rhythmic clicking of Oliver's keyboard. He was not just looking at numbers. He was dissecting a massacre. He bypassed the dummy contracts Darren had forced me to sign and tunneled directly into the core financial arteries of my company. What he found there was a level of parasitic greed that defied basic human decency. He turned the laptop toward me. The screen displayed a complex web of wire transfers, offshore routing numbers, and falsified invoices. The health insurance funds had not simply vanished into a corporate void. They had been systematically siphoned off with surgical precision. Every single dollar meant to protect the lives of my warehouse workers had been funneled directly into a ghost entity called Apex Synergy Consulting. Oliver pulled up the incorporation documents for this phantom firm. The sole registered proprietor was Melanie. She had created the fake consulting company 3 days after I stepped away to care for my dying wife. Oliver did not stop there. He tapped another key, bringing up the expense ledger for Apex Synergy. I stared at the screen, a cold, heavy knot forming tightly in my stomach. Melanie had not stolen this money to save a failing investment or pay off a desperate debt. She had drained the medical lifelines of 200 families to fund an absolute fantasy of high society extravagance. The screen showed a recent wire transfer for $800,000. The recipient was a luxury real estate broker in Tuscany, Italy. She had purchased an exclusive vacation villa using the exact funds that were legally required to cover the chemotherapy and heart medications of my employees. Below the villa purchase were endless, sickening lines of vanity expenses. There were massive charges for imported Italian sports cars, custom diamond jewelry, and private jet charters to exclusive island resorts. She was literally wearing the blood and sweat of my workforce around her neck. She had stood in my warehouse just a few hours ago wearing a pristine white designer dress and called my men replaceable commodities. She bought that exact dress using the money stolen from their families. The sheer, unadulterated malice of her actions radiated from the glowing screen. My chest tightened as a specific memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Just last month, I received a frantic phone call in the middle of the night. It was Marcus, one of my most reliable long-haul drivers. He was standing in the emergency admissions ward of the county hospital. His wife, Sarah, desperately needed an emergency arterial bypass. The hospital billing department had just informed a terrified, sobbing Marcus that his corporate health insurance policy had been completely terminated for non-payment. I drove straight to the hospital that night, pushing my truck well over the speed limit. I found Marcus pacing the waiting room, his hands shaking violently as he wept. I put my hand on his shoulder, told him to breathe, and walked directly to the billing counter. I handed the administrator my personal platinum credit card and paid the $30,000 surgical deposit out of my own pocket. I told Marcus it was nothing but a stupid, bureaucratic glitch. I assured him the corporate accounting department would have the banking error completely resolved by Monday morning. I promised him the company always took care of its own. Looking back now, the absolute truth of that night made me sick to my stomach. It was not a banking error. It was not a glitch. Darren and Melanie had actively and intentionally canceled Sarah's health insurance to ensure their Tuscan villa payment cleared the international wire exchange on time. They had knowingly traded a woman's life for a luxury vacation home. I had subsidized their ruthless theft with my own blind ignorance. Oliver closed the financial tracing window and pulled a thick physical manila folder from his leather briefcase. He slid the heavy dossier across the sticky diner table. The conversation shifted instantly from corporate embezzlement to the fraudulent medical declaration they were using to steal my freedom. I opened the folder. The first page was a comprehensive background check on Dr. Harrison Sterling, the prominent private neurologist who had signed my medical proxy. He was Melanie's maternal uncle, a man who projected an image of absolute medical authority and untarnished high society grace. The reality, as Oliver's meticulously gathered documents proved, was entirely different. Dr. Sterling was a desperate drowning man. The dossier contained court records of 3 massive pending malpractice lawsuits that were quietly bankrupting his exclusive private practice. Worse still, Oliver had uncovered the doctor's hidden offshore gambling debts. Dr. Sterling owed nearly $2 million to incredibly dangerous, unsympathetic creditors. He was weeks away from total financial and professional ruin. Oliver handed me a transcript of a recorded phone conversation. He had legally obtained a wiretap warrant through a federal judge the moment we suspected severe corporate fraud. I read the transcribed words, feeling the last remaining shreds of my paternal mercy completely disintegrate. It was a conversation between Melanie and her uncle recorded exactly 4 days ago. The doctor had never laid eyes on me. He had never conducted a single cognitive test. He had never even been in the same room as me for over 5 years. He had literally signed a blank declaration of extreme mental incompetence, stamping it with his official medical seal, and handed it directly to his niece. Melanie had filled in the devastating fabricated details of my supposed dementia herself. In exchange for this monumental violation of medical ethics and federal law, Melanie had promised her uncle a massive 10% cut of my entire personal estate the very second I was legally locked inside the state psychiatric ward. They were not simply stealing a highly profitable logistics business. They were bartering my physical freedom, my sanity, and my basic human rights to pay off a degenerate gambler's hidden debts. The cold, calculated nature of their conspiracy was absolute. They had planned my legal execution down to the very last dollar. Oliver checked the glowing monitor of his laptop once again. The heavy silence between us was suddenly broken by the sharp metallic ping of a digital alert. The 48-hour window we had established was rapidly closing. We were currently monitoring the exact honeypot account Darren believed he controlled. The digital trap was fully armed and waiting. Back in the executive suite of my logistics empire, Darren was sitting behind my heavy oak desk. He was logging into the highly secure corporate banking portal, completely unaware that his every keystroke was being mirrored and recorded by federal agents. I watched the live feed on Oliver's screen. Darren entered his newly acquired executive authorization codes. He was aggressively attempting to execute the final release of the $3 million emergency reserve. He intended to blast the funds straight into the untraceable Cayman Islands shell account before the weekend ended. The system prompted him for a final confirmation. Darren hit the enter key. The digital loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the trap slammed shut with brutal finality. A stark red notification violently popped up across Darren's screen, entirely mirroring the alert flashing on Oliver's laptop. The massive wire transfer was not just denied. The funds had vanished entirely. The account balance instantly dropped to absolute zero. A federal hold lock materialized on the screen, permanently freezing the portal. Darren's stolen crown was crumbling into dust before he even had the chance to wear it. Oliver kept his eyes glued to the glowing screen of his highly encrypted laptop. We sat in the darkest corner of the all-night diner, entirely isolated from the rest of the world. The only sound was the harsh drumming of the rain against the window pane and the rapid rhythmic clicking of Oliver's keyboard. He was not just looking at numbers. He was dissecting a massacre. He bypassed the dummy contracts Darren had forced me to sign and tunneled directly into the core financial arteries of my company. What he found there was a level of parasitic greed that defied basic human decency. He turned the laptop toward me. The screen displayed a complex web of wire transfers, offshore routing numbers, and falsified invoices. The health insurance funds had not simply vanished into a corporate void. They had been systematically siphoned off with surgical precision. Every single dollar meant to protect the lives of my warehouse workers had been funneled directly into a ghost entity called Apex Synergy Consulting. Oliver pulled up the incorporation documents for this phantom firm. The sole registered proprietor was Melanie. She had created the fake consulting company 3 days after I stepped away to care for my dying wife. Oliver did not stop there. He tapped another key, bringing up the expense ledger for Apex Synergy. I stared at the screen, a cold, heavy knot forming tightly in my stomach. Melanie had not stolen this money to save a failing investment or pay off a desperate debt. She had drained the medical lifelines of 200 families to fund an absolute fantasy of high society extravagance. The screen showed a recent wire transfer for $800,000. The recipient was a luxury real estate broker in Tuscany, Italy. She had purchased an exclusive vacation villa using the exact funds that were legally required to cover the chemotherapy and heart medications of my employees. Below the villa purchase were endless, sickening lines of vanity expenses. There were massive charges for imported Italian sports cars, custom diamond jewelry, and private jet charters to exclusive island resorts. She was literally wearing the blood and sweat of my workforce around her neck. She had stood in my warehouse just a few hours ago wearing a pristine white designer dress and called my men replaceable commodities. She bought that exact dress using the money stolen from their families. The sheer, unadulterated malice of her actions radiated from the glowing screen. My chest tightened as a specific memory hit me with the force of a physical blow. Just last month, I received a frantic phone call in the middle of the night. It was Marcus, one of my most reliable long-haul drivers. He was standing in the emergency admissions ward of the county hospital. His wife, Sarah, desperately needed an emergency arterial bypass. The hospital billing department had just informed a terrified, sobbing Marcus that his corporate health insurance policy had been completely terminated for non-payment. I drove straight to the hospital that night, pushing my truck well over the speed limit. I found Marcus pacing the waiting room, his hands shaking violently as he wept. I put my hand on his shoulder, told him to breathe, and walked directly to the billing counter. I handed the administrator my personal platinum credit card and paid the $30,000 surgical deposit out of my own pocket. I told Marcus it was nothing but a stupid bureaucratic glitch. I assured him the corporate accounting department would have the banking error completely resolved by Monday morning. I promised him the company always took care of its own. Looking back now, the absolute truth of that night made me sick to my stomach. It was not a banking error. It was not a glitch. Darren and Melanie had actively and intentionally canceled Sarah's health insurance to ensure their Tuscan villa payment cleared the international wire exchange on time. They had knowingly traded a woman's life for a luxury vacation home. I had subsidized their ruthless theft with my own blind ignorance. Oliver closed the financial tracing window and pulled a thick physical manila folder from his leather briefcase. He slid the heavy dossier across the sticky diner table. The conversation shifted instantly from corporate embezzlement to the fraudulent medical declaration they were using to steal my freedom. I opened the folder. The first page was a comprehensive background check on Dr. Harrison Sterling, the prominent private neurologist who had signed my medical proxy. He was Melanie's maternal uncle, a man who projected an image of absolute medical authority and untarnished high society grace. The reality, as Oliver's meticulously gathered documents proved, was entirely different. Dr. Sterling was a desperate drowning man. The dossier contained court records of 3 massive pending malpractice lawsuits that were quietly bankrupting his exclusive private practice. Worse still, Oliver had uncovered the doctor's hidden offshore gambling debts. Dr. Sterling owed nearly $2 million to incredibly dangerous, unsympathetic creditors. He was weeks away from total financial and professional ruin. Oliver handed me a transcript of a recorded phone conversation. He had legally obtained a wiretap warrant through a federal judge the moment we suspected severe corporate fraud. I read the transcribed words, feeling the last remaining shreds of my paternal mercy completely disintegrate. It was a conversation between Melanie and her uncle recorded exactly 4 days ago. The doctor had never laid eyes on me. He had never conducted a single cognitive test. He had never even been in the same room as me for over 5 years. He had literally signed a blank declaration of extreme mental incompetence, stamping it with his official medical seal, and handed it directly to his niece. Melanie had filled in the devastating fabricated details of my supposed dementia herself. In exchange for this monumental violation of medical ethics and federal law, Melanie had promised her uncle a massive 10% cut of my entire personal estate the very second I was legally locked inside the state psychiatric ward. They were not simply stealing a highly profitable logistics business. They were bartering my physical freedom, my sanity, and my basic human rights to pay off a degenerate gambler's hidden debts. The cold, calculated nature of their conspiracy was absolute. They had planned my legal execution down to the very last dollar. Oliver checked the glowing monitor of his laptop once again. The heavy silence between us was suddenly broken by the sharp metallic ping of a digital alert. The 48-hour window we had established was rapidly closing. We were currently monitoring the exact honeypot account Darren believed he controlled. The digital trap was fully armed and waiting. Back in the executive suite of my logistics empire, Darren was sitting behind my heavy oak desk. He was logging into the highly secure corporate banking portal, completely unaware that his every keystroke was being mirrored and recorded by federal agents. I watched the live feed on Oliver's screen. Darren entered his newly acquired executive authorization codes. He was aggressively attempting to execute the final release of the $3 million emergency reserve. He intended to blast the funds straight into the untraceable Cayman Islands shell account before the weekend ended. The system prompted him for a final confirmation. Darren hit the enter key. The digital loading icon spun for 3 agonizing seconds. Then the trap slammed shut with brutal finality. A stark red notification violently popped up across Darren's screen, entirely mirroring the alert flashing on Oliver's laptop. The massive wire transfer was not just denied. The funds had vanished entirely. The account balance instantly dropped to absolute zero. A federal hold lock materialized on the screen, permanently freezing the portal. Darren's stolen crown was crumbling into dust before he even had the chance to wear it. The absolute zero balance on their digital screens shattered whatever remained of Darren and Melanie's brittle composure. The federal hold placed on the operational accounts meant their offshore escape hatch was permanently sealed. Panic is a highly predictable catalyst. When cornered corporate thieves do not repent, they double down and search for something physical to liquidate. Desperation drove them to the most reckless decision of their entire fraudulent campaign. They decided to execute an emergency fire sale of the company's most valuable physical asset. Darren targeted the main shipping yard, an expansive, highly coveted tract of industrial waterfront property. Since the liquid cash was entirely frozen, Darren believed the physical assets were still entirely under his control, mistakenly relying on the honeypot asset transfer papers I had signed in my dining room. He reached out to Vanguard Freight, our largest and most aggressive regional rival. Darren offered them the entire main shipping yard at a staggering 40% discount in exchange for a highly expedited, untraceable cash closing. The executives at Vanguard smelled blood in the water and immediately agreed to a clandestine meeting. Darren and Melanie orchestrated the summit at Le Petit Palais, the most exclusive and heavily guarded luxury restaurant in the financial district. They booked the private dining room, attempting to mask their profound desperation behind a thin veil of high society extravagance. Darren intended to use the fraudulent transfer documents as absolute proof of his legal authority to liquidate corporate land. He needed the Vanguard executives to sign the preliminary purchase agreements and authorize a massive, non-refundable cash deposit directly into a secondary offshore account Melanie had hastily established. They were gambling their entire remaining existence on closing this one specific deal before the federal authorities fully closed the net around them. They dressed in their finest tailored clothing, masking their absolute terror behind expensive perfume and silk ties. They arrived at the restaurant fully prepared to sell my legacy out from under me for pennies on the dollar. They thought they had finally outsmarted the system. They believed the frozen accounts were a minor banking glitch and that the physical real estate was their ultimate salvation. That specific shipping yard was not just a parcel of concrete and steel. 22 years ago, I purchased that exact waterfront property from a bankrupt rival who had lost his entire fleet to corporate mismanagement. The local economy was bleeding jobs, and industrial developers were circling the property like vultures, eager to bulldoze the entire district to construct overpriced luxury condominiums. I stood on that cracked pavement with Garrett and looked out at the terrified dock workers who were about to lose their livelihoods. I made a solemn, unbreakable vow to the local community that day. I promised them that as long as I drew breath, that land would remain a dedicated working freight hub. I guaranteed them steady employment, fair union wages, and a permanent shield against the ruthless corporate gentrification destroying our city. That shipping yard became the absolute beating heart of my entire logistics network. Darren looked at the prime waterfront acreage and saw only an underutilized asset ripe for immediate liquidation. He never saw the blood, the sweat, or the sacred promises embedded in every single square foot of that concrete. I intended to keep my promise to those dock workers. I would let the entire corporate empire burn to ashes before I allowed my son to sell that sacred ground to a rival firm. The private dining room at Le Petit Palais was dripping with excessive opulence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the pristine white linen tablecloths. 3 senior executives from Vanguard Freight sat stiffly across the table, their expensive leather briefcases resting heavily on the polished mahogany floor. Darren stood at the head of the table, projecting the highly polished aura of a brilliant, forward-thinking chief executive officer. He laid out the asset transfer documents I had signed under duress, presenting them as the ultimate proof of his unquestionable authority. He confidently pitched the fire sale not as an act of desperation, but as a bold strategic maneuver to modernize our company by shedding redundant physical assets. He used empty corporate jargon to mask the sheer lunacy of the transaction. He talked about maximizing shareholder value, streamlining cross-country logistics, and pivoting toward digital freight solutions. Melanie sat directly next to the lead Vanguard buyer, utilizing every ounce of her high society charm to distract the men from the blatant red flags surrounding the sudden deal. She poured expensive vintage wine, laughed at their terribly dry corporate jokes, and subtly steered the conversation away from the company's current union strike. The Vanguard executives were seasoned predators. They knew Darren was bleeding, but the price he offered for the waterfront property was simply too lucrative to walk away from. The lead buyer pulled a gold-plated fountain pen from his breast pocket and began reviewing the final signature pages of the cash deposit agreement. Darren let out a slow, controlled breath of relief. He could already feel the millions of dollars securing his escape. He genuinely believed he had successfully outmaneuvered me. He thought the papers he coerced out of a trembling, broken old man were the ultimate keys to his total financial salvation. He leaned forward to point out the specific signature lines, his face glowing with absolute arrogant triumph. The heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open with a slow, deliberate creak that instantly severed the hushed murmurs of the corporate negotiation. The maitre d' stepped aside nervously. I walked into the room. I was not wearing the wrinkled, oversized clothes of a defeated man suffering from severe dementia. I was dressed impeccably in a tailored charcoal suit, my posture perfectly straight, my steps completely silent on the thick Persian rug. The warm light from the crystal chandelier caught the silver tie clip at my chest. I did not look crazy. I did not look broken. I looked exactly like the man who had ruthlessly dominated this city's freight industry for 4 decades. Darren's confident pitch died instantly in his throat. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. Melanie dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the table, the red liquid staining the white linen like a fresh wound. The Vanguard executives froze their hands, hovering over the purchase agreements. I did not raise my voice or offer a single word of greeting. I walked directly past the trembling waiters, pulled out the empty chair at the very head of the table, and slid into my rightful seat. Darren shot up from his chair the exact instant I sat down. The heavy wooden legs of his seat scraped violently against the polished hardwood floor, producing a sharp, agonizing screech that cut through the refined atmosphere of the private dining room. His face flushed, a deep, mottled crimson veins bulging against his stiff collar. He pointed a violently shaking finger directly at my chest and began shouting panicked orders at the restaurant staff. He demanded that the maitre d' call security immediately. He demanded that they physically remove me from the premises. He screamed that I was a medically diagnosed dementia patient who had escaped a care facility and was actively trespassing on a highly sensitive corporate function. The waiters froze in their tracks, glancing nervously between Darren's frantic, escalating aggression and my absolute, unblinking stillness. Melanie jumped to her feet, clutching her silk napkin tightly in her hands. Her voice was shrill as she eagerly echoed Darren's demands, attempting to control the narrative. She told the Vanguard executives not to worry, claiming I was highly prone to these pathetic delusional outbursts due to my advanced mental decline. I did not blink. I did not move to defend my sanity. I did not raise my voice to match their hysterical echoing pitch. I simply rested my hands flat on the pristine white tablecloth and held my silence. I let their panicked shouting fill the room. I let their chaotic energy expose their profound lack of control. The Vanguard executives stared at Darren, their professional composure cracking instantly as they witnessed his complete public meltdown. They were seasoned businessmen who recognized the distinct stench of desperation, and Darren was reeking of it. He slammed his fist down hard onto the mahogany table, violently rattling the expensive crystal wine glasses, ordering the paralyzed maitre d' to drag me out by brute force. I ignored my son entirely. I raised my right hand and gave a single subtle gesture toward the heavy oak doors. The doors swung open a second time. Oliver stepped into the dining room. My lead corporate attorney did not wear the panicked expression of a man trying to wrangle a crazy patient. He wore the cold, calculated look of an executioner carrying out a definitive sentence. Under his left arm, he held a thick stack of manila folders, each one stamped with the heavy red seal of a federal court injunction. He walked purposefully past the bewildered restaurant staff, completely ignoring Darren's furious demands to stop. Oliver stopped directly behind my right shoulder. He placed the heavy stack of cease and desist orders squarely onto the center of the table. The sharp slap of the documents hitting the wood silenced Darren instantly. I turned my attention away from my trembling son and locked eyes with the lead buyer from Vanguard Freight. I recognized Arthur Vance instantly. 10 years ago, long before Darren even possessed a corner office or wore a custom suit, Arthur and I sat directly across from each other at a high-stakes charity poker tournament in Chicago. We had played cards until 3 in the morning, aggressively testing each other's bluffs and ruthlessly breaking down each other's strategies. During that long, whiskey-soaked night, Arthur tried to aggressively buy out my southern distribution routes. I looked him dead in the eye and told him my network was not for sale, and he respected that absolute boundary. Real businessmen understand the fundamental difference between an actual owner who built an empire from the dirt up and a loud, panicked child merely wearing his father's expensive suit. Arthur knew I never bluffed when money and territory were on the line. He looked at me now, sitting firmly at the head of the table, and clearly recognized the exact same uncompromising man he had played cards against a decade ago. He did not see a frail dementia patient. He saw his old rival. I addressed Arthur directly, keeping my voice low, steady, and dangerously calm. I told him he was sitting at my table, drinking my wine, and attempting to buy my property using fraudulent paperwork signed by a desperate thief. Darren scoffed loudly, desperately attempting to reassert his rapidly crumbling authority in front of the buyers. He aggressively tapped the stack of asset transfer agreements he had forced me to sign earlier that evening under the threat of psychiatric confinement. He told Arthur to completely ignore the rambling old man, insisting he held the absolute legally binding signature granting him full executive control to liquidate the shipping yard tonight. Oliver did not wait for my command. He stepped forward and picked up the first cease and desist order from his thick stack. He slid the document directly across the white linen tablecloth until it rested perfectly in front of Arthur Vance. Oliver spoke with precise, razor-sharp legal clarity that left absolutely no room for misinterpretation. He informed the Vanguard executives that the asset transfer agreements Darren possessed were legally worthless pieces of trash. He explained that the shipping yard in question was not actually owned by the primary logistics corporation Darren was currently trying to bleed dry. I had completely anticipated this exact hostile scenario over 20 years ago when my son first demonstrated his boundless greed. I had legally severed the main shipping yard from the operational holding company and placed the physical deed into a completely separate, heavily fortified corporate trust. The operational accounts Darren controlled were just a complex facade. I was the sole irrevocable trustee of that specific hidden holding company. Oliver aggressively tapped the federal injunction resting in front of Arthur. He stated that the ironclad trust required my direct biometric verification to authorize any sale, transfer, or liquidation of the land. Darren had unknowingly tried to sell a massive commercial asset he fundamentally did not own. The realization struck Darren with the force of a physical blow. His jaw dropped, and he stared blankly at the legal documents proving his ultimate failure. Melanie gasped loudly, instinctively taking a step backward away from the table as the reality of their situation collapsed around them. Oliver calmly informed Arthur that if Vanguard Freight transferred a single dollar to Darren's offshore accounts, they would immediately become highly willing accomplices in a multi-million-dollar federal wire fraud scheme. He strongly advised the buyers to read the court injunction very carefully before they signed their own corporate death warrants right there in the restaurant. Arthur Vance did not need to read the complex legal document twice. He recognized a fatal, inescapable trap the second he saw it. He sharply closed his gold-plated fountain pen with a definitive click and shoved it aggressively back into his breast pocket. He gave me a single, highly respectful nod, fully acknowledging my total victory. Without saying a single word to Darren, Arthur signaled his team. The 3 Vanguard executives abruptly stood up, their expressions twisted in absolute professional disgust. They grabbed their heavy leather briefcases and marched straight out of the private dining room, utterly refusing to be implicated in my son's massive criminal conspiracy. Darren watched his millions of dollars literally walk out the heavy oak doors. The absolute finality of his defeat snapped whatever fragile restraint he had left in his body. He let out a raw, guttural scream of pure, unfiltered rage. He violently lunged across the mahogany table, aggressively sweeping the expensive crystal glasses and fine china plates onto the floor in a desperate, animalistic attempt to grab my throat. He did not make it halfway across the wood. The heavy, swinging doors connecting to the restaurant's kitchen suddenly burst wide open. Two men dressed in unassuming busboy uniforms stepped swiftly into the dining room. They simultaneously drew their concealed weapons and flashed gold federal badges, ordering Darren to freeze immediately. The two men in unassuming busboy uniforms moved with practiced, lethal efficiency. They holstered their sidearms only after Darren completely froze his hands, hovering inches above the shattered crystal on the floor. The taller agent stepped directly into the center of the chaotic dining room and held up his gold federal shield, letting the polished metal catch the light of the crystal chandelier. He did not raise his voice, but his absolute, uncompromising authority instantly suffocated Darren's primal rage. The agent informed my son that aggressively attempting to liquidate corporate assets using violently coerced signatures constituted multiple counts of federal wire fraud. Darren stared at the federal badge, his chest heaving, as the brutal reality of his situation slowly breached his arrogant mind. He frantically tried to speak. He tried to claim he was the legal acting chief executive of the logistics empire. He tried to argue that the asset transfer documents sitting on the mahogany table gave him the absolute right to sell the shipping yard to Vanguard Freight. The second agent cut him off, immediately stripping away his final defense. He stated that the documents Darren held were a meticulously documented federal honeypot. Every single signature on those pages had been digitally monitored, federally authorized, and completely voided the exact moment the ink dried in my dining room. They explicitly explained that violently threatening an elderly man with forced psychiatric confinement to secure a financial transaction elevated his white-collar crimes into severe, undeniable federal extortion. Darren looked back at the ruined table, realizing the entire negotiation with Vanguard Freight had been a perfectly orchestrated sting operation. He had walked willingly into a financial slaughterhouse, deeply believing he was the untouchable butcher. He had proudly presented the forged documents to the buyers, voluntarily establishing unquestionable, legally recorded proof of his own criminal intent. He had confidently delivered his own confession on a silver platter. Darren staggered backward, his expensive tailored suit practically hanging off his suddenly hollow frame. He frantically looked at the heavy oak doors, desperately calculating an escape, but the sheer weight of the federal charges anchored his feet to the Persian rug. The trap had not just snared his wealth. The trap had effectively ended his entire existence as a free man. He realized that every arrogant demand he made, every threat he issued, had simply dug his federal prison cell significantly deeper. I remained seated at the very head of the table, watching the arrogant life drain out of my son's eyes. I felt no pity. I felt absolutely no paternal urge to protect him from the devastating consequences of his own boundless greed. I vividly remembered sitting in the dark diner with Oliver, staring at the encrypted laptop screen displaying the siphoned health insurance funds. I remembered the sickening anger of seeing the exact digital route where the medical lifelines of 200 hardworking families were actively diverted to fund a luxury Tuscan villa. That was the precise moment the final thread of my fatherly mercy permanently snapped. I reached into my coat pocket right there in the diner, pulled out my phone, and called the federal authorities directly. I handed them the corporate financial ledgers. I handed them the wiretap transcripts. I handed them my own flesh and blood. A man who steals the cancer treatments and heart medications from innocent women to buy imported Italian sports cars has fundamentally forfeited his right to any family protection. I built my entire life on the ironclad principle of fiercely protecting the vulnerable people who rely on my leadership. I protect my loyal drivers. I protect my dedicated dock workers. I protect my community. I absolutely do not protect ruthless criminals, even if those criminals share my DNA and carry my last name. Melanie watched the federal agents flank her husband and instantly realized the corporate ship was sinking straight to the bottom. Absolute survival instinct overrode her high society loyalty in a fraction of a second. She violently pushed her chair back, intentionally placing physical distance between herself and Darren. She raised her hands in a frantic gesture of surrender, tears rapidly welling up in her perfectly manicured eyes. She raised her voice, letting a shrill, desperate panic bleed into her carefully practiced tone. She pointed directly at Darren and loudly claimed that she was a terrified hostage in his criminal enterprise. She swore to the federal agents that Darren had brutally forced her to participate in the hostile corporate takeover. She played the tragic victim card flawlessly, weeping openly and insisting she had absolutely no knowledge of the embezzled health insurance funds or the fraudulent land sale. She desperately begged the officers for immunity, claiming she was just an obedient, frightened wife trapped in a highly abusive marriage. Darren slowly turned his head to look at her, completely paralyzed by the sheer velocity of her vicious betrayal. They were tearing each other to pieces right there in the private dining room, turning on each other like starved animals fighting over the last scrap of meat. The taller federal agent watched her theatrical performance with a completely blank expression. He let her sob and plead for a full minute before calmly opening his suit jacket and pulling out a folded piece of paper. He ignored her fake tears entirely. He held up a pristine copy of the fraudulent medical proxy she had proudly weaponized in my living room. He informed Melanie that the private neurologist she bribed was currently sitting in a federal interrogation room, heavily cooperating with the authorities to avoid his own prison sentence. The agent stated that because she had purposefully secured a fraudulent medical document across state lines to illegally seize control of a corporate entity, she was no longer considered a passive bystander. She was formally classified as a primary co-conspirator in a massive federal fraud syndicate. Her tears stopped instantly. The manufactured color vanished from her cheeks, leaving her pale and violently trembling. She realized her dramatic victim routine meant absolutely nothing against a staggering mountain of documented federal evidence. The federal agents carefully holstered their weapons. They stated they were not going to physically arrest Darren and Melanie tonight. They calmly explained they were simply securing the perimeter while the district attorney finalized the massive stack of grand jury indictments required to freeze every single remaining asset they possessed. The agents informed them that their passports were already flagged and any attempt to flee the city would result in an immediate tactical raid. They turned their backs on the shattered couple and walked out through the heavy oak doors, leaving Darren and Melanie entirely trapped in their own living nightmare. I stood up from my chair, adjusted my silk tie, and followed the agents out of the room without looking back. The terrified restaurant manager slowly approached the ruined dining table, trembling as he handed Darren the leather binder containing the astronomical bill for the private room and the vintage wine. Darren numbly reached into his wallet and handed the manager his heavy platinum corporate card. The manager returned 90 seconds later, placing the card back on the table. He quietly stated the transaction had been completely declined. Melanie frantically opened her personal banking application on her phone to transfer the funds from her secret accounts. She stared at the screen as her hands began to shake uncontrollably. Her massive balance read absolute zero. A glaring red digital hold had been placed by the Internal Revenue Service for suspected international tax evasion. I sat quietly in Oliver's downtown office, nursing a cup of black coffee while watching the high-definition security feed broadcasted directly from the main logistics headquarters. The harsh, unforgiving sunlight of Monday morning washed over the sleek glass doors of the executive entrance, highlighting every raindrop left over from the weekend storms. At precisely 8 o'clock, Darren's leased luxury sedan abruptly pulled up to the curb. He stepped out aggressively, adjusting his expensive suit jacket, desperately trying to project the image of a man still firmly in control of his domain. He marched up the concrete steps with a fabricated arrogance, fully intending to lock himself inside the corner office to somehow spin the weekend's catastrophic failures into a manageable corporate misunderstanding. I watched him pull his silver keycard from his pocket and confidently swipe it across the magnetic reader. A sharp, solid red light flashed across the scanner. The heavy glass doors remained completely locked. Darren frowned, swiped the card a second time, and received the exact same red rejection. His manufactured composure instantly evaporated into thin air. He began violently slapping his palm against the reinforced glass, shouting angry, muffled demands at the empty lobby. The interior shadows of the building slowly shifted. Garrett walked out of the dispatch corridor, his heavy work boots striking the polished floor with deliberate, measured purpose. He was wearing his faded canvas jacket and a grim, uncompromising expression. Flanking him on either side were 4 massive dock workers, men with thick arms and calloused hands who had spent decades moving heavy freight on my yards. The electronic locks clicked loudly and the glass doors slid open just wide enough for the 5 men to step outside. They instantly formed an impenetrable human barricade across the executive entrance. Darren stopped banging on the glass, taking a hesitant step backward as the sheer physical presence of the workforce loomed over him. He demanded that Garrett step aside and let the chief executive officer into the building. Garrett did not move a single inch. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, looked down at my son with absolute unfiltered disgust, and ordered Darren to step off the private property immediately. Darren had harbored a vicious, deep-seated hatred for Garrett since he was a teenager. My son always viewed the yard manager as nothing more than the hired help, a dirty, uneducated relic from the era when I operated this entire business out of a single rusted garage. Darren possessed an advanced business degree from a highly prestigious university and firmly believed that printed credentials and expensive tailored clothing dictated absolute power in the modern world. He actively despised the grease permanently embedded under Garrett's fingernails and hated the way I consistently treated the yard manager as my respected equal. What Darren fundamentally failed to understand was the heavy currency of loyalty within the logistics industry. The men who drove the transport trucks and physically moved the freight did not respect a polished corner office or a sharp suit. They answered exclusively to the man who bled with them on the loading docks. They respected the leader who worked brutal 30-hour shifts during freezing blizzards to ensure the fragile supply chains remained unbroken. Garrett had earned his unshakable authority through 4 decades of shared grueling sacrifice. Darren arrogantly expected the entire workforce to bow to him simply because his last name matched the painted logo on the side of our transport vehicles. Darren puffed out his chest, attempting to aggressively weaponize his corporate title against the men blocking his path. His voice pitched higher as he threatened to call the local police and have Garrett and the 4 dock workers immediately arrested for criminal insubordination and trespassing. He screamed that he legally owned the building, the trucks, and their paychecks. Garrett remained entirely unfazed by the hysterical outburst. He reached inside the deep pocket of his canvas jacket and pulled out a crisp, heavy white envelope. He extended his muscular arm and firmly pressed the envelope flat against Darren's chest, forcing my son to take hold of it or let it fall to the wet pavement. Garrett spoke with a slow, gravelly calm, explaining the contents of the document. While Darren was panicking over frozen federal honeypot accounts and ruined luxury real estate deals on Sunday evening, Oliver and I had convened an emergency, legally binding meeting of the corporate board of directors. The board thoroughly reviewed the undeniable, heavily documented evidence of corporate embezzlement, the malicious cancellation of employee health insurance policies, and the highly illegal attempt to sell the main shipping yard to Vanguard Freight. The vote to physically and legally remove Darren was absolute and unanimous. The envelope contained his formal notice of immediate termination. He was officially stripped of all executive titles, salary privileges, corporate banking access, and physical entry rights to any company property across the state. Garrett calmly informed Darren that his corporate leased vehicle was currently being repossessed, and that his personal office belongings had already been unceremoniously dumped into a cardboard box resting by the loading bay dumpsters. Garrett then turned Darren's police threat directly back against him. He checked his wristwatch and stated that if Darren did not turn around and walk away from the property line in exactly 30 seconds, the yard security team would forcefully detain him for criminal trespassing. Darren stood completely frozen on the concrete steps, his knuckles turning white as he clutched the termination letter. The crushing reality of his total corporate exile finally breached his arrogant delusion. The 4 massive dock workers simultaneously took a heavy, unified step forward, physically forcing Darren to stumble backward off the curb and onto the wet asphalt. He was an absolute ghost to the empire he tried to steal. His smartphone suddenly began to vibrate frantically inside his suit pocket. He pulled the device out, staring blankly at the screen. The caller identification displayed Melanie's name. Darren answered the call, his hand shaking desperately, hoping she had miraculously found a legal loophole or successfully accessed a hidden offshore account to save them. Instead of a calculated strategy, a piercing, hysterical scream blasted through the small speaker. Melanie was sobbing uncontrollably, her voice completely broken by raw panic. She screamed that their private gated mansion was entirely surrounded by unmarked black vehicles. Dozens of federal agents wearing heavy tactical vests were actively raiding their home. She frantically detailed how the agents were violently ripping financial records from the walls, seizing their encrypted computers, and actively towing their imported luxury cars straight out of the cobblestone driveway. The federal net had completely closed around them. Darren sprinted away from the corporate headquarters, his chest heaving as the cold rain soaked through his expensive wool suit. His leased executive vehicle had already been towed, forcing him to hail a passing taxi. He frantically yelled at the driver to speed toward his gated suburban community. The moment the taxi turned onto his private cul-de-sac, the sheer scale of the disaster became completely visible. The heavy iron security gates of his estate were locked wide open. The sweeping cobblestone driveway was absolutely jammed with unmarked black tactical vehicles, and local police cruisers with their light bars flashing silently in the gray morning mist. Darren shoved a fistful of crumpled bills at the driver and scrambled out of the cab before it even fully stopped. He ran up the driveway, slipping on the wet stones, staring in absolute horror at the systematic dismantling of his luxurious life. Men and women wearing federal windbreakers were marching in and out of the massive mahogany front doors. They were carrying heavy cardboard boxes filled entirely with physical financial ledgers, encrypted hard drives, and seized electronic devices. The operational center of his corporate theft was being gutted in broad daylight. On the manicured front lawn, Melanie was completely hysterical. She was standing in the pouring rain without an umbrella, her silk blouse soaked and clinging to her arms. She pointed her manicured fingers aggressively at the federal agents hauling a massive custom-built desktop computer out the front door. She screamed at the top of her lungs, demanding they put her property down immediately. She shrieked that they were violently violating her constitutional rights and threatened to sue every single officer present for criminal trespass and personal harassment. Her shrill voice echoed off the neighboring mansions, drawing the attention of wealthy neighbors who were quietly watching the spectacle from their front windows. The federal agents completely ignored her frantic performance. They moved with mechanical, absolute efficiency, treating her screaming as nothing more than background noise. Darren pushed his way through the line of uniformed officers guarding the perimeter tape. He tried to grab Melanie's arm to pull her back, but she violently ripped her shoulder away from his grasp. She looked at him with wild, terrified eyes, demanding he fix the situation instantly. She screamed that he was the supposed corporate genius and ordered him to make the federal agents leave their property. Darren stood paralyzed on his own front lawn, entirely incapable of stopping the brutal federal machine that was actively stripping his life down to the bare studs. He was watching the absolute collapse of his stolen kingdom. Darren looked past his screaming wife and stared at the imposing stone facade of the sprawling mansion. Every single architectural detail of this estate represented a direct malicious theft from my logistics company. Just 2 years ago, Melanie had demanded a complete floor-to-ceiling renovation of the property. She insisted on importing $500,000 worth of rare vein-cut Italian marble for the grand foyer and the master bathrooms. She claimed the extravagant upgrade was absolutely necessary to host elite social gatherings and project the proper image of a dominant corporate dynasty. Darren authorized the massive wire transfer without a second thought, burying the exorbitant personal expense inside a complex web of falsified corporate equipment upgrades. During that exact same financial quarter, the safety committee at the main shipping yard had submitted a desperate, formal request for upgraded reinforced steel toe boots and high-visibility winter weather gear for the night shift drivers. Darren had summarily denied the worker safety request, citing severe corporate budget constraints and necessary fiscal austerity. He forced men to walk on freezing, slick loading docks in deteriorating footwear so his wife could walk barefoot across heated Italian stone. The breathtaking scale of their vanity was built entirely on the physical suffering of the very people who generated their wealth. The federal agents marching across that imported marble were now stepping on the undeniable solid proof of their ruthless corporate embezzlement. Darren felt a sudden, desperate surge of false authority. He stormed past the perimeter tape and marched directly up the stone steps toward the lead federal agent coordinating the removal of evidence. Darren squared his shoulders, puffed out his chest, and aggressively demanded that the agents cease all activities immediately. He loudly declared that this property was a private, legally protected residence, and that they had absolutely no jurisdiction to seize personal assets without a fully litigated court order. The lead agent stopped writing on his clipboard. He looked Darren up and down with an expression of total, unfiltered boredom. The agent reached into his heavy tactical vest and pulled out a thick, multi-page legal document bearing the fresh, embossed seal of a federal judge. He slapped the seizure warrant directly against Darren's chest, mirroring the exact humiliating motion Garrett had executed just an hour earlier. The agent calmly informed Darren that this document was a comprehensive federal asset forfeiture order. The intricate forensic accounting provided by my lawyer earlier that morning had explicitly proven that every single brick of this mansion, every luxury vehicle in the garage, and every piece of custom furniture had been purchased exclusively with embezzled corporate funds and stolen medical insurance premiums. Because the assets were the direct proceeds of severe federal wire fraud, the property did not belong to Darren or Melanie. It legally belonged to the state. Melanie stopped screaming at the officers and turned slowly to look at Darren. The horrifying reality of the federal agent's words completely shattered her delusion. She was not just losing her wealth. She was losing her entire high society identity. The survival instinct that had caused her to turn on Darren at the restaurant instantly flared up again. She marched across the wet grass, raised her right hand, and slapped Darren viciously across the face. The sharp crack echoed over the sound of the rain. She did not shed a single tear for him. She pointed a trembling finger at his face, her voice dripping with absolute venom. She loudly blamed his utter incompetence for their total ruin. She screamed that he was a pathetic failure who could not even successfully execute a simple corporate takeover against a weak old man. She shrieked that she had wasted her youth on a weak coward who had just stripped her of everything. The fragile, opportunistic alliance that held their marriage together completely disintegrated on the front lawn. The lead federal agent stepped between the feuding couple, entirely uninterested in their sudden domestic collapse. He checked his heavy tactical watch and delivered his final uncompromising directive. He informed Darren and Melanie that they had exactly 60 minutes to enter the property under strict armed supervision. They were legally permitted to pack exactly one standard suitcase each, strictly limited to basic personal clothing and essential toiletries. Any jewelry, electronics, cash, or valuable accessories were classified as seized federal evidence and would be immediately confiscated at the door. Following the 60-minute packing window, they would be permanently escorted off the premises and entirely locked out. They were effectively homeless, stripped of every stolen dollar and every ounce of unearned luxury. Darren stood completely paralyzed on the wet cobblestones, his cheeks stinging violently from his wife's slap and his mind entirely incapable of processing his absolute, total destruction. He slowly turned his head away from the shouting federal agents and looked down the long, manicured street leading out of the luxury subdivision. Parked quietly in the deep shadows beneath a massive oak tree, completely immune to the pouring rain, was my black sedan. I was sitting perfectly still in the back seat behind the tinted glass, watching the spectacular total collapse of the false empire he tried to build on my back. Darren stood frozen on the wet cobblestones, the sharp sting of Melanie's slap fading against the biting chill of the torrential downpour. He stared down the long, manicured street. The black sedan sat in the deep shadows of the massive oak tree, its engine idling with a low, steady, predatory hum. The tinted windows completely obscured the interior, but Darren knew exactly who was sitting in the back seat. Desperation, raw and metallic, flooded his mouth. He had absolutely no money, no corporate shield, no allies, and a wife who had just publicly turned on him. The federal agents behind him were actively dismantling his entire life piece by piece, boxing up his fraudulent empire. He took a hesitant step toward the sedan, then another. He began to run his expensive Italian leather shoes, slipping wildly on the slick, rain-swept asphalt. The heavy downpour instantly plastered his custom-tailored suit to his skin, completely washing away the last arrogant remnants of the untouchable chief executive officer. He reached the black car, slamming his wet palms flat against the rear passenger window. He banged his fists against the reinforced glass, leaving smeared handprints across the dark tint. He screamed my name into the storm, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of its usual polished corporate cadence. He begged me to roll down the window. He pleaded for just 5 minutes of my time. He shouted that the federal agents were taking absolutely everything, that his accounts were entirely frozen, that he was about to be federally indicted and thrown out onto the street with nothing. When the tinted glass remained completely motionless, Darren abruptly changed his strategy. He abandoned his desperate corporate bargaining and resorted to the lowest form of emotional extortion. He pressed his wet face against the cold glass and invoked his mother. He screamed Evelyn's name into the driving rain. He cried out that she would be absolutely horrified to see her only son destroyed and publicly humiliated like this. He yelled that my late wife would never under any circumstances allow me to unleash a pack of ruthless federal prosecutors on her own child. He begged me to call Oliver to call off the corporate lawyers, to order the federal agents to immediately drop the asset forfeiture warrants. He promised to permanently walk away from the logistics empire, to sign whatever legally binding documents I wanted if I just stopped the absolute annihilation of his life. He aggressively weaponized the memory of a dead woman, attempting to use her ghost as a shield against his own catastrophic criminal consequences. Inside the quiet, climate-controlled sanctuary of the sedan, I stared straight ahead, my hands gripping the leather armrest from the back seat as I leaned slightly forward. The sound of Darren's frantic pounding was heavily muffled by the thick acoustic glass. The desperate mention of Evelyn did not shatter my resolve or summon any hidden well of paternal mercy. It solidified my anger into hardened, unbreakable steel. My mind instantly flashed back to a sterile white hospital room 15 years ago. The cardiac monitors beeped a slow, failing rhythm. Evelyn lay in the narrow institutional bed, her skin pale and paper-thin, her breathing shallow as the aggressive illness finally overtook her frail body. She held my hand with a surprisingly fierce grip in her final fading moments. She looked me directly in the eyes and made me swear a single unbreakable oath. She asked me to ensure that Darren grew into a man of absolute honor. She wanted a son who built his legacy on hard work, profound integrity, and respect for the people working beneath him, not unearned entitlement and cowardly deceit. I promised her I would guide him. For 15 years I tried to fulfill that sacred vow. I offered him comprehensive mentorship, boundless opportunity, and the hardest, most valuable lessons of the ruthless business world. Darren aggressively rejected all of it, actively choosing the path of an arrogant, lazy thief instead. Protecting a man who deliberately steals medical funds from blue-collar workers to purchase imported marble is not an act of love. Shielding a criminal from the devastating legal consequences of his own boundless greed is a total, unforgivable betrayal of everything Evelyn stood for. I would not dishonor her memory by saving a monster. I reached forward and pressed the silver button on the door panel. The tinted window rolled down exactly 2 inches, stopping with a sharp mechanical click. The sudden opening allowed the biting wind and the deafening roar of the torrential rain to instantly invade the silent cabin, carrying the distinct scent of wet asphalt and Darren's sour, suffocating desperation. Darren instantly pressed his face to the narrow gap, his wet hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes wide and violently bloodshot. He started rambling, vomiting a chaotic, pathetic stream of apologies and frantic promises to personally repay every single stolen dollar if I just made the federal agents go away. I did not raise my voice over the storm. I spoke in a low, even dangerous tone that cut through his hysteria with absolute surgical precision. I commanded him to stop invoking his mother's name to justify his pathetic cowardice. I informed him that Evelyn prayed every night for a son who possessed the moral fortitude to stand tall during a storm, not a spineless parasite who built a fraudulent fortune by actively bleeding the very people he was supposed to protect. A real man accepts the crushing weight of his failures. A real leader stands before the devastating consequences of his boundless greed without begging for an unearned bailout. I looked directly into his panicked, pleading eyes and stated with total uncompromising finality that he would not receive a single dollar from my accounts. I would not authorize Oliver to draft a single protective injunction. I would not make a single phone call to the federal prosecutors or the district attorney to soften the blow. He made the conscious, highly calculated decision to wage a ruthless corporate war against his own blood, and he must now navigate the bloody battlefield he created entirely on his own. I told him the federal agents currently swarming his stolen mansion were not a misunderstanding. They were the direct, unavoidable harvest of the poisonous seeds he confidently planted the day he decided to treat my company like his personal piggy bank. There would be no rescue. There would be no golden parachute. There would only be the cold, hard, inescapable reality of the federal criminal justice system. I pressed the button on the door panel a second time. The tinted window glided smoothly upward, severing his frantic pleas mid-sentence and sealing the cabin in absolute, impenetrable silence once again. I tapped the glass partition separating the front seat and gave my driver a single definitive nod. The heavy sedan shifted into gear and pulled smoothly away from the curb. Darren chased the accelerating car for a few pathetic yards, his soaked suit clinging tightly to his frame before his legs finally gave out. I watched him in the rearview mirror as he collapsed heavily onto his knees on the rain-slicked asphalt, surrounded entirely by the flashing red and blue lights of his own ruin, completely swallowed by the violent storm. Back on the sprawling front lawn of the seized estate, Melanie stood shivering violently under the unrelenting downpour, clutching her expensive smartphone. The glowing screen illuminated her pale, terrified face as a call forced its way through the chaotic noise of the raid. She answered with badly trembling fingers. On the other end of the line, her mother was weeping hysterically. The news dropped like a physical executioner's blade. Her uncle, the private neurologist who gladly forged the medical proxy for a heavy bribe, had just been formally arrested by the FBI at his private medical clinic. He had officially confessed to extensive medical fraud and explicitly named Melanie as the primary architect of the extortion plot. She dropped the phone onto the wet grass. She was entirely isolated, federally implicated, and completely out of time. The morning rain had finally stopped by the time my driver pulled up to the towering glass facade of the Central Logistics headquarters. The building I had built from a single concrete garage now reached 30 stories into the gray sky. I walked through the sliding automatic doors. The lobby was completely silent. The usual frantic energy of a Monday morning was entirely absent. Word of the federal raid on Darren's estate had already swept through the corporate grapevine with the speed of a wildfire. I bypassed the private executive elevator and took the main glass lift straight to the 30th floor. I wanted every single employee to see me. I wanted them to know the absolute owner had returned to reclaim his territory. I walked down the long carpeted corridor toward the primary boardroom. Through the heavy glass walls, I could see them waiting. 12 senior executives sat around the massive mahogany table. These were the men and women Darren had handpicked and promoted to run my empire into the ground. They were wearing their expensive tailored suits and their luxury watches, but their faces were completely pale. Their hands were shaking. Some stared at their polished leather portfolios, too terrified to look up. Others anxiously checked their silent phones, desperately hoping for a miraculous bailout that would never come. I opened the heavy doors and stepped into the room. The silence was absolute. It was a thick, suffocating silence born of pure, unadulterated terror. They knew exactly why I was there. They knew the federal authorities were currently dissecting their corrupt financial ledgers. I walked slowly past the trembling executives. I did not offer a single word of greeting. I did not acknowledge their nervous, pleading glances. I walked directly to the head of the table. I pulled out the heavy leather chair that Darren had illegally occupied for the past 2 years, and I sat down. I rested my hands flat on the polished wood and looked at each of them in turn. I let the silence stretch. I let the silence stretch until it became a physical weight pressing down on their chests. I let the silence stretch to emphasize their absolute vulnerability. 5 years ago, I had personally approved the hiring of every single person sitting in this room. I brought them in to modernize our aging logistics network. I gave them access to state-of-the-art technology, massive operational budgets, and profound corporate authority. I wanted them to streamline our shipping routes and secure the financial future of our blue-collar workforce. Instead, they traded their corporate integrity for Darren's offshore bonuses. They watched my son systematically siphon millions of dollars from the employee health insurance funds, and they chose to look the other way. They signed off on fraudulent expense reports to fund Melanie's imported Italian marble. They approved the malicious denial of basic safety equipment for the night shift dock workers, because Darren promised them massive quarterly dividends in return for their absolute silence. They became incredibly comfortable in their corner offices. They became incredibly comfortable cashing their inflated checks. They became incredibly comfortable destroying the lives of the men and women working on the loading docks. They had completely forgotten who actually built this company from the ground up. They had forgotten who owned the physical trucks, the distribution centers, and the very ground beneath their feet. They looked at a fragile old man and assumed the ship was entirely theirs to plunder. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to shout to establish my total authority over the room. I kept my tone low, steady, and dangerously calm. I looked directly at the chief financial officer, a man sweating profusely into his silk collar, and informed him that corporate negligence is a deeply unforgivable offense. I reached into my leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of formal, heavily embossed documents. I placed my hand firmly on top of the stack. I told the room that I had spent the entire weekend reviewing every single financial transaction authorized during Darren's fraudulent tenure. I explicitly detailed how their collective willful ignorance had nearly bankrupted a 40-year legacy. I slid the thick stack of pink slips directly across the center of the mahogany table. The papers fanned out across the polished wood, stopping perfectly in front of the terrified executives. I fired the entire upper management team simultaneously. I officially terminated them for gross negligence, severe corporate malpractice, and willing complicity in federal wire fraud. I informed them that Oliver was currently downstairs actively cooperating with the federal prosecutors, explicitly handing over all their internal communications regarding Darren's embezzlement. A collective gasp echoed through the room. The vice president of logistics opened his mouth to protest, desperately trying to formulate a legal defense, but the heavy boardroom doors swung open before a single word could escape his throat. Garrett stepped into the room. He was still wearing his faded canvas work jacket and his heavy steel toe boots. The distinct smell of rain and diesel fuel clung to his clothes, completely shattering the sterile illusion of the executive suite. The fired executives stared at him in absolute shock. I looked at the men and women who had nearly destroyed my company, and I pointed directly at Garrett. I promoted the yard manager to the position of vice president of corporate operations right there on the spot. I granted him absolute unquestioned executive authority over the entire logistics network. I told the room that from this moment forward, the company would be run by a man who actually knew the heavy price of blood and sweat. The fired executives did not attempt to argue. The sheer overwhelming reality of their total defeat left them entirely paralyzed. They slowly reached for their expensive leather portfolios and began packing their belongings in complete humiliating silence. They knew they were walking out of this building with absolutely no severance packages, no corporate recommendations, and a massive federal investigation looming directly over their heads. As the broken management team filed out of the glass doors under the watchful eyes of corporate security, Oliver stepped into the boardroom. My lead attorney looked tired but profoundly focused. He carried his heavy briefcase in one hand, but in his right hand he held a massive bound corporate checkbook. He placed the heavy ledger down onto the mahogany table directly in front of me and opened it to the first blank page. He informed me that the federal authorities had successfully unfrozen the primary operational accounts following the raid on Darren's estate. The stolen millions had been officially recovered. I looked at Garrett, and Garrett looked back at me. We both knew the corporate executions were only the initial easiest phase of the recovery. I picked up my gold fountain pen. It was time to ride down the elevator and face the massive crowd of angry, betrayed truck drivers waiting in the pouring rain out in the loading bay. The true test of my leadership was only just beginning. The descent in the glass elevator felt like a slow plunge into a hostile abyss. The polished chrome doors slid open to the ground floor, and the sterile hum of corporate climate control gave way to the raw, damp chill of the loading bay. The torrential rain had reduced to a steady, oppressive drizzle, casting a gray pall over the massive concrete expanse. Hundreds of workers stood tightly packed across the dock. They were drivers, loaders, foremen, and heavy diesel mechanics. The neon safety lights illuminated their faces, revealing deeply etched lines of exhaustion, anger, and profound betrayal. They stood with their arms crossed over their heavy winter jackets, a silent army ready to physically mutiny against the corporate crown. They had spent the last 8 months absorbing Darren's relentless daily abuse. They had watched their overtime pay vanish, their union grievances deliberately ignored, and their critical medical insurance quietly drained to fund a lifestyle they would never see. They did not look at me with the reverence of the past. They looked at me with the hardened, cynical glare of men who fully expected another meticulously crafted corporate lie. I stepped off the elevated platform and walked directly onto the cracked concrete floor, deliberately abandoning the physical separation of the executive level. The crowd shifted slightly, a wave of hostile tension rippling through the heavy silence. A few men at the front spat on the wet ground near my polished shoes. I did not flinch. I did not demand order or absolute silence. The silence was already complete, heavy with the threat of imminent violence. They believed I had actively authorized Darren's hostile reign. They believed I had comfortably retired to a luxury estate while they bled on the docks to keep my empire afloat. I stopped exactly 10 feet away from the front line of heavily armed workers. Garrett stood slightly to my left, his newly appointed executive status entirely meaningless to the men until I proved my own worth. A massive bearded foreman named Miller took a deliberate half-step forward. His heavy work shirt was stained with fresh motor oil. He stared directly into my eyes and demanded to know why they should listen to a single word from a man who let his own sons steal their children's cancer treatments. The raw, unfiltered aggression in his voice was not insubordination. It was the desperate roar of a father who had been pushed to the absolute brink of total financial ruin. The massive crowd behind Miller tightened their ranks, murmuring in dark, hostile agreement. They were entirely done with speeches, empty promises, and corporate restructuring plans. They wanted blood, or they wanted their stolen money returned to them immediately today without any further delays. Looking directly at Miller's furious, exhausted face, my mind instantly snapped back 40 years. I clearly remembered the very first day I officially opened this logistics company. We possessed exactly 3 rusted transport trucks, a leaking warehouse roof, and 0 guaranteed shipping contracts. I stood on this exact same plot of dirt long before the concrete foundation was ever poured. I looked at the original crew of 6 desperate men who had blindly trusted me with their fragile livelihoods. I made a solemn, unbreakable vow to them on that freezing winter morning. I swore on my very life that my men would always eat before I did. I promised that no executive would ever cash a bonus check while a driver struggled to pay a basic medical bill. That singular, unyielding principle built an unbreakable foundation of fierce generational loyalty. I had built a national empire by honoring that absolute standard. Darren had systematically dismantled it by violating the core tenet of our shared survival. I had mistakenly allowed my focus to drift towards sterile boardrooms and global expansion strategies, leaving the gate wide open for a parasite to feed on my foundation. The men standing before me did not care about my legacy or my past corporate achievements. They only cared about their stolen security and their families. It was entirely my responsibility to fulfill that old promise right here, right now, using the absolute maximum force of my own personal private wealth to fix this. I did not offer a single word of apology. Empty apologies are the cheap currency of weak men caught in their own failures. I set my heavy leather briefcase squarely on the yellow hood of a nearby forklift. The sharp, metallic snap of the brass locks echoed clearly across the silent loading bay. I opened the reinforced lid and pulled out a single heavily embossed document. It was not a corporate restructuring proposal or a legal promise to investigate the missing funds over the next quarter. It was a certified, irrevocable bank draft drawn directly from my private, heavily fortified offshore trust account. I turned to Garrett and handed him the heavy piece of paper. I ordered him to read the exact figure aloud to the men. Garrett looked down at the draft. His eyes widened slightly as his mind processed the sheer magnitude of the number printed boldly across the secure watermark. He raised his head and projected his booming, gravelly voice across the damp concrete yard. He announced that the check fully replaced every single missing dollar from the employee health insurance pool. He then announced that the draft included an additional immediate 30% hazard bonus for every single worker standing on the dock, fully compensating them for the 8 months of corporate abuse and unpaid overtime. A massive shockwave rippled through the tightly packed crowd. Miller stepped aggressively forward, snatching the certified draft directly from Garrett's hand. He stared at the 9-figure sum, his calloused thumb tracing the raised ink of the banking seal. He fiercely scrutinized the document, desperately searching for a corporate loophole or a hidden contingency clause. He found absolutely nothing but cleared, untouchable cash. I looked directly at Miller and stated that my son was currently facing severe federal indictments for his crimes and he would never set foot on this property again. I informed the men that the company trust was now permanently locked and their medical coverage was retroactively reinstated, fully funded for the next 10 consecutive years. I did not ask for their forgiveness. I simply proved that I was willing to personally bleed my own private fortune dry to ensure they were made completely whole today. I backed my leadership with absolute, undeniable financial force, restoring order to the chaos Darren left behind. My deliberate actions spoke significantly louder than any empty corporate speech ever could. The entire loading dock fell utterly, profoundly silent. The heavy tension that had suffocated the concrete bay for months instantly shattered. Miller slowly lowered the certified bank draft. The furious, hardened lines on his weathered face cracked into an expression of sheer disbelief, followed rapidly by overwhelming relief. He looked at me, gave a single deep nod of absolute respect, and turned to face the massive crowd. He raised the heavy financial document high into the damp morning air. The hundreds of hardened workers erupted into a deafening, unified roar of pure victory. The massive cheers echoed violently off the high warehouse ceilings, completely drowning out the ambient sound of the falling rain. The deep generational loyalty that Darren had so carelessly destroyed was instantly and permanently restored. Men slapped each other on the back, the crushing weight of their financial ruin fully lifted. I stood beside Garrett, quietly watching the intense celebration, feeling the true heartbeat of my empire return to a steady, powerful rhythm. The triumph was absolute, but the loud cheering was suddenly and aggressively pierced by a high-pitched, escalating wail. The sharp sound of multiple approaching sirens rapidly cut through the raw noise of the workers. Several local police cruisers swung aggressively around the corner of the main road, their bright blue and red lights slicing through the gray mist. They accelerated straight toward the open front gate for the final act. The wail of the sirens grew deafening as the convoy of local police cruisers and unmarked federal tactical vehicles breached the main gates of the logistics headquarters. The massive crowd of cheering truck drivers and dock workers immediately parted, creating a wide, silent path across the cracked concrete of the loading bay. The heavy tires of the law enforcement vehicles hissed against the wet asphalt, coming to a synchronized halt directly in front of the executive loading ramp where I stood with Garrett and Miller. The flashing red and blue light bars painted the gray morning mist with chaotic bursts of color, casting long, frantic shadows across the faces of the betrayed workforce. Inside the back of the lead patrol car, seated behind a heavy steel mesh partition, was Darren. His expensive wool suit was entirely ruined, soaked with rainwater and stained with mud from his pathetic collapse on the cobblestone driveway of his seized estate. He sat with his head bowed, his shoulders slumped in absolute total defeat. In the second police cruiser parked directly behind him sat Melanie. Her pristine, high society facade had been completely eradicated. Her expensive silk blouse was torn, her designer mascara was smeared darkly down her pale cheeks, and her hands were bound tightly behind her back with heavy metal cuffs. They had been apprehended at the mansion, systematically processed by the federal raid team, and were now being formally transported to the county jail for booking. The lead detective had deliberately routed the transport convoy straight through the central shipping yard. It was a highly calculated maneuver designed to publicly parade the corporate thieves directly past the hundreds of blue-collar workers they had so viciously defrauded. The visual impact was instantaneous and profound. The men standing on the docks did not hurl insults or throw debris. They simply watched the flashing vehicles in absolute punishing silence. The quiet weight of hundreds of condemning stares pressed heavily against the reinforced glass of the police cruisers. Darren flinched visibly under the collective gaze of the men whose cancer treatments and overtime wages he had stolen to finance his vanity. He tried to turn his face away from the window, desperate to hide his utter humiliation, but there was absolutely nowhere left to run. He was finally trapped in a cage he had built entirely with his own boundless arrogance. The workers stood tall, their stolen livelihoods fully restored by my hand, watching the definitive end of the corporate parasite who had nearly destroyed their families. I stood near the edge of the concrete platform and watched the flashing emergency lights illuminate my son's ruined face. A profound, heavy sorrow settled deep into my chest, a heavy ache that only a father forced to witness the total destruction of his own flesh and blood could possibly understand. I remembered teaching Darren how to ride his first bicycle, holding him steady when he faltered. I remembered standing proudly at his university graduation, foolishly believing he would use his brilliant mind to expand our legacy with honor and integrity. But intertwined with that suffocating sorrow was a cold, absolute certainty. I felt absolutely no regret for orchestrating this brutal downfall. Over the past few weeks, I had meticulously analyzed his systemic corporate thefts, watching him deliberately siphon the lifeblood out of our hardworking employees without a single ounce of empathy. Darren was not simply a misguided executive who had made a poor financial calculation. He was a malignant tumor feeding aggressively on the healthy tissue of this company. I recognized long ago that you cannot negotiate with a malignancy. You cannot offer it a compromise or hope it magically changes its destructive nature. You must ruthlessly and entirely excise the tumor to save the host. I had chosen to save the hundreds of innocent families relying on my logistics network, even if it meant permanently destroying the man who carried my last name. Protecting a thief is not an act of honor. The heavy door of the lead unmarked vehicle swung open. The lead federal detective stepped out onto the damp concrete, holding a weatherproof binder tight against his chest. He pulled his collar up against the lingering drizzle and walked purposefully up the steel steps of the loading dock until he stood directly in front of me. He did not waste time with formal pleasantries. He spoke with the crisp, uncompromising efficiency of a man actively building an ironclad criminal prosecution. He informed me that Darren and Melanie were officially facing multiple counts of massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy across state lines. The district attorney was currently preparing to bring the full weight of the federal justice system down upon them. The detective looked me dead in the eye and asked if I was fully prepared to take the stand at the upcoming grand jury hearing. He needed my sworn, direct testimony to legally authenticate the corporate ledgers and seal the federal indictments permanently. Before I could answer, a violent commotion erupted from the second patrol car. Melanie had managed to roll her window down a fraction of an inch using her chin. She pressed her tear-streaked face against the narrow gap and began screaming hysterically across the silent loading bay. She completely abandoned any lingering pretense of marital loyalty. She loudly offered to testify entirely against Darren in exchange for immediate federal immunity. She shrieked that she possessed a hidden flash drive containing Darren's secret offshore routing numbers, his encrypted emails with the Vanguard executives, and the private ledgers detailing his medical insurance theft. She eagerly offered to hand the prosecution every single nail required to seal her husband's coffin, desperately begging the detective to let her walk free. The raw, unfiltered betrayal echoed off the high warehouse ceilings. The detective did not even turn his head to acknowledge her pathetic, shrieking barter. He kept his steady gaze locked entirely on me, waiting for my final answer. The workers on the dock watched the incredible spectacle, disgusted by the sheer venomous cowardice of the woman who had happily spent their stolen wages just days prior. She was willing to burn her entire world to ash just to save her own skin. I held up a hand, silently asking the lead detective for a single moment. I walked slowly down the steel steps of the loading dock and approached the first police cruiser. I stopped inches from the reinforced glass and looked directly through the heavy metal mesh. Darren sat trembling in the back seat, his wrists bound tightly in iron. He slowly lifted his head, but the second he met my gaze, he violently flinched. He could not maintain eye contact with the man whose legacy he had tried to slaughter. He dropped his eyes to the rubber floorboard, completely shattered, entirely unable to face the absolute reality of his own pathetic reflection. I did not offer him a single word of comfort or an ounce of fatherly forgiveness. I simply turned my back on his cage and walked steadily back up to the platform. I faced the federal detective and gave him my final, unwavering commitment. I confirmed that I would provide absolutely all necessary testimony, present every hidden ledger, and sit before the grand jury to ensure my son received the absolute maximum federal sentence allowed by law. The detective gave a single respectful nod. He turned, walked back to his vehicle, and signaled the convoy. The sirens wailed and the police cruisers drove away, taking the thieves out of my empire forever. 3 months had passed since the morning the federal cruisers carried my son away from the logistics yard. The heavy oak doors of the federal courthouse swung shut, sealing the packed gallery in a tense, expectant silence. Every single wooden bench was filled to maximum capacity. Dozens of my dock workers, men and women who had suffered under Darren's ruthless, fraudulent reign, packed the rear pews. They sat shoulder to shoulder, their faces hard and unreadable, demanding to witness the final measure of justice. At the defense table, Darren sat completely motionless. The arrogant, untouchable chief executive officer was entirely gone. He was wearing a standard-issue faded orange prison uniform that hung loosely from his shrinking frame. His skin was sallow, deprived of the sun and the imported Italian marble he had traded his soul to acquire. His hands, cuffed at the wrists during transport, now lay flat and trembling against the polished defense table. He looked small. He looked fundamentally broken. He looked like a man who had finally realized the absolute totality of his destruction. He did not turn around to look at the gallery. He kept his hollow, sunken eyes locked firmly on the empty witness stand. Sitting at the prosecution table directly opposing him was Melanie. She was not wearing the damp, ruined silk blouse from the day of the raid. She wore a sharp, conservative gray suit, her hair pulled back tightly, deliberately projecting the image of a naive, victimized wife. The moment the federal agents had placed her in the holding cell, her opportunistic survival instinct had taken complete control. She had aggressively pursued a comprehensive plea deal, ruthlessly trading her marital vows for a heavily reduced sentence. She had fully agreed to turn state's evidence, actively volunteering to become the prosecution's primary weapon against her own husband. She sat beside the federal prosecutors, actively avoiding Darren's gaze, perfectly prepared to tear him apart on the stand to save her own skin. The fragile alliance, built on imported marble and stolen money, had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. She was ready to deliver the killing blow. The air in the courtroom was heavy, suffocating thick with the anticipation of a corporate execution. The workers waited. The judge waited. The federal machine waited to process the man who thought he was entirely above the law. I sat perfectly still in the very first row of the gallery, directly behind the prosecution table. I was wearing a dark tailored charcoal suit. It was the exact same suit I had worn 15 years ago to stand beside Evelyn's open grave. I had worn it on the day I buried the love of my life, the day I made a sacred vow to raise our son into a man of profound honor. I chose to wear it again today because I was attending another funeral. I was not burying my son in the cold, damp earth. I was actively participating in burying him under thousands of pounds of federal concrete and steel. Evelyn had slipped away quietly, her hand gripping mine, holding fiercely to the hope that Darren would become a beacon of integrity. I sat in the hard wooden pew, feeling the heavy, suffocating weight of my profound failure as a father. I had provided him with every tool, every opportunity, and every lesson required to build a righteous empire. He took those tools and actively forged his own prison cell. He took those opportunities and aggressively stole from the men who built our wealth. The son I had promised to protect had died the very moment he decided my blue-collar workers were simply collateral damage. The man sitting at the defense table was a stranger, a corporate parasite wearing my last name, and I was fully prepared to watch him be permanently excised from society. The lead federal prosecutor stood and approached the center of the courtroom holding a thick electronic tablet. He did not waste time with theatrical opening statements. He began a systematic, brutal dismantling of Darren's entire fraudulent empire. The prosecutor pressed a button and the courtroom's audio system crackled to life. High-definition recordings echoed off the mahogany walls. It was Darren's own voice captured on federal wiretaps casually authorizing the illegal transfer of employee health insurance premiums into private offshore trusts. His voice sounded arrogant, dismissive, completely devoid of basic human empathy as he ordered the financial blackout of the workers' medical coverage. The workers in the gallery shifted angrily in their seats, listening to the exact moments their lives were traded for luxury assets. The prosecutor then projected the forged medical documents onto the massive digital screens. He meticulously traced the forged signatures, the bribed neurologists' falsified assessments, and the highly illegal corporate proxy Darren had used to seize my operational control. The paper trail was absolute flawless and undeniably damning. Then the prosecutor called his star witness. Melanie stood up, smoothed her conservative suit, and walked confidently to the witness stand. She raised her right hand, swore an oath to the truth, and immediately began to lie with masterful precision. She painted herself as a terrified, heavily manipulated victim. She testified that Darren was a psychological monster, a ruthless, controlling megalomaniac who forced her to participate in the embezzlement under severe emotional duress. She wept highly calculated tears, claiming she had absolutely no idea the millions of dollars funding their lavish lifestyle were actively stolen from sick and dying workers. She systematically unloaded every single ounce of criminal liability directly onto Darren's shoulders, providing the jury with explicit dates, hidden account passwords, and devastating internal emails. Darren sat paralyzed at the defense table. His highly paid corporate defense attorneys sat completely silent, entirely outmatched and outmaneuvered by the sheer volume of undeniable federal evidence. His defense did not just fail, it completely and totally crumbled into dust. He stared at Melanie, his mouth slightly open, completely unable to comprehend the absolute depth of her betrayal. Every single defense strategy, every legal loophole, every desperate attempt to shift the blame was systematically crushed by her devastating testimony. The prosecution rested its case, leaving a silent, stunned courtroom staring at a man who possessed absolutely nothing left to hide behind. The federal judge instructed the jury and dismissed them to begin their formal deliberations. In complex corporate fraud cases involving millions of stolen dollars, deliberations routinely lasted for several grueling days, sometimes extending into exhausting weeks of intense legal debate. The jury returned to the courtroom in less than 2 hours. The sheer, terrifying speed of their return sent a violent, visible shockwave directly through Darren's spine. He stood up as the 12 men and women filed back into the jury box, his hands gripping the edge of the defense table so tightly his knuckles turned a sickly, translucent white. He looked completely hollowed out, entirely consumed by the crushing gravity of the moment. The heavy oak doors were sealed shut. The armed bailiffs took their strict positions at the exits. The federal judge, a man with a stern, unyielding expression, looked over his reading glasses and addressed the jury box. He asked the jury foreman if they had successfully reached a unanimous verdict on all federal charges. The foreman, a stoic older woman, stood up holding a single sheet of paper. She looked directly at Darren, her face entirely devoid of sympathy, and confirmed that they had. The judge firmly ordered the defendant to face the jury and commanded the foreman to read the verdict aloud for the official court record. The silence that instantly descended upon the packed courtroom was absolute, heavy, and completely suffocating. The foreman stood frozen, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he clutched the legal document, the weight of the moment pressing down on the loading dock. A deathly silence blanketed the yard, turning the roar of heavy machinery into a distant, inconsequential hum. The men around him hardened by months of uncertainty, and the bitter sting of betrayal stared at the bank draft as if it were a mirage. Then, a low rumble started in the back ranks, swelling into a deafening, thunderous ovation. Men threw their hard hats into the air. Others gripped each other in fierce, unspoken solidarity. The betrayal that had festered within the company for months was cauterized by a single definitive act of restitution. The loyalty of the workforce, once considered lost, surged back with a fervor that shook the very foundations of the warehouse. The celebration was cut short. A piercing, high-pitched wail erupted from the front gate, slicing through the cheers like a blade. Multiple police cruisers' lights swirling in aggressive, rhythmic pulses swerved toward the loading bay. The crowd instinctively retreated, clearing a wide, silent path. The vehicles halted with a jarring screech of tires on wet concrete. I stepped forward, my hands locked behind my back, watching the officers emerge with their hands resting on their sidearms. The lead detective walked straight toward me, his expression grim. He looked at Darren and Melanie in the back of the cruisers, then at me. It was over. The game of corporate extortion had reached its terminal point. As the officers moved to process the final arrests, I felt a deep, resonant sorrow. It was the heavy, inevitable weight of a father watching his son finally arrive at the destination he had chosen for himself. I felt absolutely no regret for my actions. A tumor cannot be nurtured without poisoning the entire body. I had done what was necessary to excise the rot and preserve the integrity of the men and women who had built this life alongside me. 6 months had passed. The cold autumn air bit at the skin, but the warehouse was filled with the rhythmic, productive roar of heavy diesel engines. The shipping bays were operating at maximum capacity, the logistics network finally running with the precise, efficient discipline of a well-oiled machine. Garrett walked across the concrete floor, his stride confident, his uniform crisp. He stopped at the primary loading dock where I stood watching the fleet pull out for the morning run. He handed me the quarterly performance report. I glanced at the figures, noting the significant uptick in efficiency and the record profit margins. The workers were thriving, their faces reflecting a newfound stability and pride. The company had never been stronger or more profitable. A single plain white envelope arrived in the morning mail from the federal penitentiary. The return address was cold and official, marked with the serial number assigned to Darren. I held the letter in my hand for a long time, the paper feeling heavy, as if it contained the entire weight of our shattered history. I did not open it. There was nothing left to say that hadn't been already addressed in the silence of the courtroom or the finality of the verdict. I walked over to the heavy industrial shredder located in the office corner. I dropped the unopened envelope into the intake slot. I listened to the sharp mechanical sound of the blades destroying the paper, grinding the final words into meaningless dust. I poured a fresh cup of black coffee, the steam curling into the morning air. I stepped out onto the loading dock, breathing in the sharp, familiar scent of diesel and the lingering dampness of the recent rain. The storm had finally passed. The foundation of this company held firm, reinforced by hard work and absolute integrity. The silence that surrounded me was finally my own, earned through fire and restored by truth. The verdict was read by the foreman, his voice steady despite the suffocating weight of the room. Guilty on all counts: federal wire fraud, systemic embezzlement, and egregious elder abuse. The judge sentenced Darren to 12 years in a federal penitentiary. Melanie, having bartered her soul for a chance at freedom, received 4 years for her calculated complicity. As the bailiffs moved and the heavy metal cuffs clicked shut around Darren's wrists, he turned slowly, locking eyes with me one final time from the center of the courtroom. There were no tears remaining in his eyes, only the hollow, frigid realization of his own design. He had spent years meticulously dismantling the integrity of everything I had built, and now he was finally forced to stare at the ruins he had created. I nodded once, a silent, grim acknowledgement of the consequences he had earned through his own choices. There was no joy in this moment, only a profound, settling closure. The heavy steel door groaned shut behind them, effectively burying the man I had once hoped would be my successor, not in dirt, but in the unrelenting confinement of concrete and steel. 6 months have passed since the gavel fell. I sit on a wooden bench in the main warehouse, the air thick with the smell of engine grease and the distant hum of industry. The massive bay doors are open, and I watch the fleet of trucks moving efficiently along the perimeter. They are on time, loaded to capacity, and fueled by a renewed sense of purpose. Garrett approaches his stride, purposeful and calm. He hands me the quarterly report, his face showing a rare, satisfied smile. The company is operating with unprecedented efficiency. Our profit margins have surpassed every historical benchmark, but more importantly, the atmosphere among the staff has transformed. The workers are thriving, their benefits fully restored, their futures once again secure. The rot has been excised, and the body of the business is stronger than it has ever been. A letter arrives from the federal penitentiary. It is from Darren. I look at the envelope for a long time, the paper white and crisp against the industrial gloom of the desk. I do not open it. There is nothing left for him to say that has not already been shouted in the halls of justice. I stand and walk over to the heavy-duty industrial shredder. I drop the envelope inside and listen to the sharp, aggressive sound of the blades destroying the paper, grinding the lies and the past into unrecognizable dust. I pour a fresh cup of black coffee, step out onto the sun-drenched loading dock, and breathe in the scent of diesel and the clean air after the rain. The storm is over. The foundation holds firm. The silence is finally my own. Reflecting on this journey, I have learned the most painful and essential lesson of leadership and fatherhood. Mercy without justice is merely a slow form of destruction. I spent years believing that my love for Darren was enough to shield him from the harsh realities of the world. I thought that by smoothing his path, I was teaching him the value of his inheritance. I was wrong. By protecting him from the consequences of his minor failings, I allowed his sense of entitlement to fester into a terminal greed that eventually consumed everything he touched. True stewardship requires the courage to say no, the strength to let those we love fail when they act dishonorably, and the wisdom to prioritize the greater good over personal sentiment. My greatest mistake was failing to hold him to the same standard of integrity that built this company. I provided him with the fruit of my labor, but I failed to teach him the cost of growing it. Love, when stripped of accountability, becomes a poison that blinds the recipient to their own moral decay. I have learned that the greatest gift a parent can offer is not an easy life, but the expectation of excellence and the certainty that betrayal of one's own honor will always yield a harvest of sorrow. We are responsible not only for the lives we bring into this world, but for the values we insist they uphold, even when it demands the ultimate sacrifice of letting them go to save the collective. Now look at your own life and the relationships you hold dear. Are you protecting someone from the consequences of their actions, believing that your intervention is a form of love? You might be enabling a behavior that will eventually destroy them. True love demands the strength to set boundaries. If you find yourself in a situation where your kindness is being mistaken for weakness, or where your support is fueling someone else's greed or lack of integrity, it is time to reassess your position. Do not wait for a total collapse to assert your values. Take a stand today for the integrity of your life and the businesses you have built. If you have been struggling with a situation that demands a firm, difficult decision, share your story in the comments below. Let us build a community where honor and accountability are the foundations of our success. Subscribe to the channel to join a journey of learning resilience and reclaiming the truth. The storm passes, but the foundation you build today is what remains when the rain stops. Choose to be the architect of your own peace.